Okay, ready.
Okay, so welcome everyone to our inter-university workshop on the epistemic and political significance of metaphors. Good morning to the ones who are joining from Mexico. Good afternoon to the ones in Europe. So this is a collaboration between the University of Puebla and the University of Innsbruck, more specifically between the research groups Phenomenology and Hermeneutics in Puebla, Mexico, and the research group membership Metaphors as doorkeepers of the FAF, Austria. So it's already the second edition of this event. Most of you were here last time, and as Saida said already, last year it took place physically in Puebla, and the ones from Austria and other places were joining virtually. And this year this could not happen because unexpectedly the university is closed. So we are all meeting here in this virtual space. What also has changed a little bit since last year is the format. It became, I would say, a bit more experimental. So we're not going to present our own papers, but rather debate texts that we found to be key texts on the political and epistemological significance of metaphors. We really have a fine selection now. While reading these texts, I'm convinced that there are many correspondences between them. So yes, we have a quite tight schedule. Let me just briefly explain the proceedings. My name is Stephanie Graf, and I'm going to moderate the first half of our workshop, and then we have a very short break, maybe 5 minutes break, so everyone can just get up from their seats for a moment. And then my colleague Saida Olvera is taking over and leads us through the last part of the workshop. So we have commentators or people responsible on the respective texts, and we will start each session by listening to the comments. Sometimes we have one commentator, sometimes we have more. So we'll have the comments beforehand, and then we'll have a discussion, questions, comments that can be either responded by the commentators, or they can be open, and we just figure out among each other who's gonna have associations on the topic. So maybe we have already here in the chat, I don't know if everyone sees it, the link for the broadcasting. So if anyone still wants to invite friends and family and interested people to listen, this could be the moment.
Let me just do one quick remark. Whenever you want to take part on the discussion, please raise the hand, the function of the hand, so we can all see the order and we don't miss anyone, okay?
Okay. So the first text that we're going to discuss is a section from Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, named Total Domination. And without further ado, I would give the word to Florian Pistrol, who will first comment on this text.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me all right. I want to extend my thanks very briefly to you, Stephanie, and to you, Saida, for organizing this whole thing. And I will get straight into it. I should be no longer than 5 minutes, but I've written a text, so here it goes. Hell is arguably the most powerful and persuasive construct of the human imagination in the Western tradition. so at least says Scott G. Bruce, the editor of the Penguin Book of Hell, which brings together depictions of the infernal from antiquity to the present day. Those who peruse this fascinating, if at times distressing volume, will quickly come to the conclusion that the role of hell has changed dramatically over the past few centuries. Once regarded as a punitive afterlife awaiting all sinners, great and small, hell now functions as an all-pervasive metaphor for any kind of difficulty or extreme. It is perhaps not surprising then that Arendt should avail herself of this time-honored image in her discussion of the Nazi concentration camps. Indeed, given that hell lends itself to the description of almost any experience of a negative kind, one might be forgiven for thinking her use of it a poor choice and wondering, if you will pardon the bad pun, why the hell she would resort to cliché when dealing with a subject as grave as the plight of the victims of Nazi aggression. I partly agree with this notion. Arendt certainly does not deserve a prize for verbal creativity. I do think, however, that there is some logic to her employing the metaphor of hell, or so I will argue in the next few minutes. Throughout Total Domination, the 20-odd pages of the origins of totalitarianism that treat the Nazi concentration camps, as well as, though to a lesser extent, the Soviet gulags, Arendt places great emphasis on what she calls the air of mad unreality that surrounds them. The camps, she tells us on page 445, constitute, quote, a phantom world which, however, has materialized, as it were, into a world which is complete with all sensual data of reality, but lacks that structure of consequence and responsibility without which reality remains for us a mass of incomprehensible data, unquote. What she means by that is that the rules of common sense do not apply in the camps. The consequence being, as she puts it on page 459, that, quote, we actually have nothing to fall back on in order to understand the phenomenon that nevertheless confronts us with its overpowering reality and breaks down all standards we know, unquote. Those who ignore this and cling to common sense regardless are either delusional or, worse, playing into the hands of those who think it superficial to dwell on horrors. And dwell on horrors we must, Arendt insists. Yet how exactly are we to do this if it is true that common sense is of no help whatsoever? Arendt's answer to this question is that we should exercise our fearful imagination. And although she does not say so herself, I think that her use of the metaphor of hell is best understood as an instance of just such fearful imagining. To see why this might be the case, two things are important. The first is that when she compares the DP camps to Hades, the Soviet gulags to purgatory, and the Nazi camps to hell, she has in mind the traditional view of them. It follows that, apart from the idea of a last judgment and the notion of divine grace, we are free to conjure up all the madness of torture and cruelty we find associated with the infernal afterlife in theology, philosophy, and literary fiction. The second point, essential to my claim that the metaphor of hell is an example of what it means to imagine fearfully, concerns Arendt's conception of metaphor as developed in the first volume of The Life of the Mind. Here, Arendt argues that what metaphor does is to provide what is not given to the senses with an intuition drawn from the world of appearances, thus establishing the reality of our concepts. And because philosophy usually trades in things that are abstract, justice, beauty, truth, etc., metaphor is indispensable to it. Indeed, in Arendt's eyes, all philosophical terms are metaphors, frozen analogies. All this sounds straightforward enough. However, if we try to apply Arendt's definition of metaphor to her discussion of the camps, we immediately find ourselves in a quandary. For by employing the metaphor of hell, Arendt asks us to consider what we have not experienced ourselves, camp life, in terms not of some intuition we possess, but of not in terms not of an intuition we possess, but of another thing we have no first-hand experience of, hell. What are we to make of this? There are two options, I think. One is to interpret Arendt's use of the metaphor of hell as clear evidence of the inconsistency of her thinking. The other option, and this is the one I subscribe to, is that she is fully aware of introducing what is at bottom a flawed metaphor. The image of hell invites us to connect the camps with otherworldly evil. Yet because it ultimately does not work as a metaphor, at least not according to the definition given by Arendt, we are reminded that any comparison between the camps and hell is doomed to fall short. In Arendt's view, however, this is no reason to drop the metaphor of hell, quite the contrary. And if this is so, then what she calls fearful imagination should be construed, to borrow a phrase from Georges Didi Lieberman, as an imagining in spite of all. Thank you. That's my short comment.
Okay, great, Florian. Thank you so much for this introduction. So we have a second comment on the text by Victor Luque. Take it away. Your audio is still off.
Right there?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry, it's too bloody early and still a little sleepy. Well, I'm going to work with Florian introduction of the concept of Arendt's metaphor, but I'm going to focus especially on the problems of thinking the concentrated universe as the world of the living death. This concept not only of the image of hell, but the metaphor of the prisoners in the camps as living death. That, well, because pop culture and everything, it sounds like zombies. But no, it's not like that. For example, well, I don't know if you are already familiar with the concept of Musulmaner in the camps. It's supposed to be like the lowest level of human condition, the lowest level of materialistic existence in terms of hunger, in terms of famine, in terms of, how you say it, exhaustion. Like the principal character of the concentrated universe were called Musulmaner because it supposedly resembles a Muslim when it's praying, like it's just there, like in this pose. A lot of witness recalls these characters as the principle of the result of the camps. Mostly for the Nazi camps, but in the Gulag, there also the phenomenon, how you say it? Well, there's like a parallel. They were called dohodiagis, that it means to reach the final step of life, or in sarcastic ways, to reach socialism. They're like parallel uh, genres of existence inside the concentrated universe. Well, what I think is the problem with this concept of the world of the living death, I think what Arendt did is that she translates or displays this concept of Musulmaner to the whole society, with quotation marks, of the concentration camps. Why I say this? Because both two witnesses that she quotes inside not only the origins of totalitarianism, but also in this subchapter of total domination, Eugene Kogon, I don't know how to pronounce the last name, and David Rousset, both describe this phenomenon. I'm going to quote Rousset, Les Jours de Notre Mort, dantesque skeletons, the concavities of the eyes hollow, walking at the mercy of circumstances on pestilent waste. They lean on a beam, heads down, and they remain motionless for an hour, 2 hours. A little later, the body dejected. The living corpse was transformed into a dead corpse. we can find in this testimony that Arendt quotes the term, well, Dantesque skeletons, which, well, the image of hell that we have, it's more from the Divine Comedy of Dante, more than a theological structure of hell. And the other one of Eugene Kogon, and I quote, people with an unconditional fatalism. They were willing to die not because of an act of will, but because their will was annihilated. They let happen to death what happened because all their efforts were paralyzed or had been destroyed. These both descriptions of Musulmaner by Eugene Kogon and David Rousset are what Arendt calls the living dead inside the camps. But she describes like for all the prisoners. And the problem with it is that inside the concentration camps, there was something that I call a concentratory condition, like a middle step between human condition and the Musulmaner, who is the end result of the camps. In this middle section, we can find a society, well, a kind of damaged society, or more damaged society, that because we can find the terms of organized solidarity, and even we can find what Arendt called the importance of spontaneity. This, well, in the first paragraph of Total Domination, she said that the concentration camps try to destroy spontaneity. Like there were labs for totalitarian domination to try to destroy this condition of humanity. But the problem with the metaphor of of thinking the prisoners as living dead is that it denies the little freedom, you can say, that exists in the camps. And just to finish, I'm going to quote David Rousset. No, sorry, I'm going to quote Eugene Kogan. It is curious, but there was probably no other place in Germany where politics could be discussed as clearly as in the concentration camps. This is like a really weird phrase from someone who survived Buchenwald, but Eugene Kogan describes the possibilities of not only human condition in Arendt's terms, but also of human agency, possibility, and spontaneity in this, well, in the concentrated universe. And well, I think that's all for me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you. I think we have now, as we started a little bit late, 10 to 15 minutes of questions and comments, if you all agree. So I'm sure that there are a lot of comments from your side. So please raise your little yellow hands so we can see the order. Who wants to start? If not, I mean, I have some inquiries to make. I missed part of Victor's comment because I flew out of the session for a moment. But I have some inquiries to Florian, what you said. I found it very interesting that you somehow saved Arendt by saying that the inconsistency is like part of the argument, so to say, of this use of the metaphor of hell, or insisting of using it, even though there are obviously some shortcomings to it. So I heard that your explanation for the shortcoming, or your focus on the shortcoming, was that in her conception of metaphor, metaphor would be an intuition drawn from the sensual world, or from the maybe the empirical world. And please correct me if I'm wrong there. So then the inconsistency would be that hell as a religious concept, or as a concept drawn from theology, cannot really, it does not really fit this definition of an intuition drawn from the senses. But then I'm asking myself that there are other, there could be another way to approach Arendt's employment of metaphor here, because she starts to name all, or to number all kind of not sufficient analogies drawn from the real world. And no, she starts to explain that cannot be compared to any sort of forced labor, etc. So she's working with similarities, no? And then, of course, the religious conceptions of hell, purgatory, and Hades come into a similarity, or a constellation of similarity, because of their outer worldliness, no, of their unreality. But then again, there are other outer worldly images maybe to draw upon. And what at least the Christian conceptions of hell and purgatory share is that they are a punishment. So they are an outer worldly space where people are punished for. So this is the inconsistency I want to inquire a bit. So why to draw on an image that's used to punish, to describe the concentrary universe? So that could be maybe, yeah, another inconsistency there, and even inconsistent with the with your way of saving it. I hope I made myself clear.
Well, you did. Two things probably. The first is that I'm not the biggest fan of the metaphor of hell myself, and my first thought when reading Arendt's text, well, I've read it many times now, is that why the hell, indeed, would you use the metaphor of hell when it's such a cliche, as I've pointed out. And so for me, the task I set myself was to provide some sort of answer for this question, why she should use this metaphor. It's pretty easy to say, well, that's just a stupid choice of metaphor, and let us be done with it. The fact is, however, that a lot of survivors, countless survivors, I would say, and I know that you know this as well, draw precisely on the image of hell when they describe their experiences. You find it in Primo Levi, you find it in Elie Wiesel, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are many inconsistencies, and Arendt herself points out several times, and I would say throughout the section we've all read, that those in the camps are precisely the innocent. And even if someone is a criminal, he only is transferred to the camp, or can call themselves really a camp inmate the moment they're innocent. So she clearly drops the idea that the camp has anything to do with punishment. And she also says that the image of hell should not lead us to think that it's something to do with a last judgment or divine grace or whatever. And so we have to ask ourselves, I think, if we try to make any sense of her use of the metaphor of hell, why she still sticks to it. My explanation would be that she considers it precisely a flawed metaphor. So she associates hell with cruelty, with slaughter, with all things terrible. And she says, but still it's a metaphor that ultimately does not work in accordance with what I think metaphors are. And so it's a flawed metaphor, and I would think that what we can learn from here is that we have to use metaphors or images or similes or whatever to somehow glimpse at the ghastly reality of Auschwitz. But we have to be aware that all these devices ultimately fall short.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any more questions or comments on the Arendt text? Saida.
Yes, thank you. Maybe this is a question for both of you, Florian and Victor. But I will begin by referring to what Florian just mentioned. When I was reading the text, I found a sort of methodological justification for the use of these metaphors. And I found it very appealing because it reminded me to what Blumenberg also says concerning the resources of metaphors. So at one point, Arendt mentions that these metaphors are the only images we have to envision something that we cannot comprehend. So she's always reflecting on the mad or irreality and madness of that situation. And she mentions that this is what we have to see. It's like if metaphors were the last resource, so to say, the last cognitive resource to envision horror or something that actually we cannot comprehend, so to say. So on the one hand, it is the last epistemological research to approach something that rationally or conceptually we are not able to grasp. But on the other hand, there is constantly in your presentations the comments on the non-adequacy of metaphors. So it is as if there were also criteria to establish a good metaphor and a bad metaphor. But what would that be? I don't know. I'm not asking you only to answer this question. Maybe this is a huge question that we are all asking ourselves in this kind of meetings. But precisely, what would it be the criteria to determine when a metaphor is accurate or not? And this question is very tricky because this is precisely what metaphors are not. That's not the task of a metaphor, right? To be accurate. Well, I'm talking about from the Blumenberg's perspective, criticizing the way philosophical tradition has considered language as a tool to make reference to an object, and metaphors wouldn't be at all useful to that because they are not at all adequate instruments to refer with accuracy to something. So what would it be then, the criteria to determine if this metaphor is accurate or not? This is a question for all of you in general.
Well, sorry. I don't have an answer to this question in particular, that I think it's a very important one, specifically when you're actually dealing with historical research on metaphors. And I think we can further along the process, when we go into Blumenberg, discuss the complexities that come hand in hand with this. But I do think that one thing that is very clear in this use of the hell metaphor is that these images do have consequences, and it's something that Arendt states while she's describing how people, by associating life in the fields with the image of hell, asks themselves the question, what did these people do? Like that's the immediate response, because since hell is an image for punishment, then the way in which the mind operates through this metaphor is by looking sin that had to be punished. Which I think it's quite interesting, because most of the time we operate with these metaphors and with their consequences kind of in a predetermined way, without taking notice of the consequences that these images have. And another aspect that I find important on this thing that Florian said is that this quote that he made when Arendt says, "We have nothing to fall back on to face this overpowering reality," is textually maybe something that would explain the uses of metaphor just as Blumenberg describes. So kind of the lack of conceptual means to try to grasp something that is ununderstandable or logically incompatible. It's, even if that's not an intent that she's making with this phrase, I think works kind of as a title for what we're going to discuss later.
I think someone wanted to say something before, but I did not see who it was. We also have a question in the chat by Aristeo Castro. Maybe I'm going to read it out loud. Probably there is a problem with the microphone. Thanks for the presentations, he says. Is there a specific use of metaphor in politics that could be or could represent a different use that it has, for instance, in rhetoric? So I'm not sure who feels him or herself responsible to answer that question. And I would propose, as in all my authority as a moderator, that we could let this question just stand a little bit longer in the virtual room, because I think it's going to be probably answered, or at least they're gonna be proposals of answering when we come to the other texts, specifically to Blumenberg and Schmitt. Is that okay for everyone? Okay, so yeah, as I said before, we have a quite tight schedule. So if there are no immediate and urgent comments or answers right now, I would propose to pass to the next text, which is a section from Walter Benjamin's Origin of the Baroque Mourning Play. We have different translations for that, right? A section named Allegory and Trauerspiel. And we have 3 comments on this section. The first one is Laurin Markowitz, then myself, and then Daniel Gönnitzer. So yeah, without further ado, I think Laurin has checked in and is ready. So please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Steffi, for the introduction and for organizing this event, and for everybody else who was involved in making this happen. Yeah, so this section on allegory in the Trauerspiel, I think it has a couple of interesting points, and I want to introduce a little bit into the subject, and maybe start into the first couple of pages, which I think are essential for understanding what is the interest of Benjamin in this project, and why does he engage or criticize this form of aesthetics that is he associates with the German Trauerspiel. What is so at the beginning of this section, he really identifies the aesthetics of these times with an anesthetics, I would say, with a form of narcoticism, a form of finding some significance somewhere else, and which is also a way of dulling our desire for a feeling of depth within a time of revolution and upheaval of uncertainties of signifiers that he somehow sees in this form of romantic performance art, theater, a form of also an appropriation of the bourgeois citizen class of a noble form of, let's say, narrative that connects human existence with eternity. And in that form, he is also claiming that this is a moralizing bombast, this emancipating class produces to produce some kind of a self-conscious moral individuum that is finding its part within the quasi-divine realm of natural history. So let me come just to the very first pages where he differentiates between the different forms of symbol and the symbolic and the allegoric within classicist, Baroque, and Romantic aesthetics. So let me just say one more word about this relation between the Romantic and the Baroque in that point, that sense. Why is that important? Before I come then to the symbolic and the allegorical. So the position of the individual gains the shifts in Romantic aesthetics away from the idea of being part of a community, being part of some kind of a society, and also being in a dialectical relationship, exchange within this social horizon that Benjamin also identifies as the church, the ecumenic community, where the individual is always somehow only part of a bigger plan and not its manifestation in itself. And this is exactly what in Romanticism the individual gains this, becomes somehow the ethical, becomes somehow the sole realm of self-realization and self-consciousness, whereas the political component of the Baroque aesthetics is somehow lost. And I think this is a motivation for Benjamin also to come now to this, what is the romantic idea of the symbolic and the allegorical. So he emphasizes in the allegorical in relation to the symbolic does not necessarily have a relation to some divine or absolute order. It's the allegorical is somehow a mere series of events that are related to one another as moments within a narrative structure. Whereas the symbolic, on the other hand, is always not just a mere representation of some essence, but it is this essence in itself. It's its manifestation rather than its representation. And I think this, on the other hand, the allegorical is always somehow contingent, never really manifest and never really expressing in itself the essence of a series of events or relations to some essence, but it is rather some kind of a speculative thought process that is going from one moment to another without having to legitimize the series of these events in some divine beginning or absolute end. And I want to just maybe stop with this question that what is it then that is the functional value of the allegory? What are we to do with allegory? If it's the allegory is not in a way a narrative that is foundational, that is relating our lived experience to some general plan, but rather lacking exactly this absolute moment, and which is a form of speculative thought that is in a way maybe experimental, interpretatory, rather than explanatory. And if it is as such as I interpret this passage, what is then, maybe we can later also, like maybe if you want to just continue, Steffi, but to keep that in mind, what are we to make with allegory? If it does not tell us anything with authority, if the allegory lacks authority and truth, what is its functionality for, let's say for the bürgerliches Trauerspiel, but what is its functionality for also other cultural products of our time and yeah, for our contemporary cultural manifestations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I will happily accept your proposal and your question to keep in mind what are we gonna make out of it, and also what are we gonna make out of allegory in a political critical sense. I will maybe briefly continue, and even in what I've prepared, there could be some hints to an answer, and then Daniel will finish this section by also commenting on it. So I wanted to briefly say something on the idea of natural history that you also already mentioned, Lauren, and then get to a section that Benjamin calls the antinomies of allegorical meaning, and try to figure out how they are connected. So natural history, I would say, could be understood as the metaphysical structure that underlies this artistic form of the Baroque morning play. And I'm using this wording, metaphysical structure, that underlies the self-understanding of this age, a little bit in reference to Carl Schmitt. This is a formulation that we also have read in the text of political theology. And as you might know, the Trauerspielbuch of Benjamin can be read as an answer in the discussion with Carl Schmitt, and uses a lot of methodological devices by Carl Schmitt with a specific twist. So this natural history, as I already maybe pointed to now, can see from the background of a theological shift, of a theological shift of a self-understanding of the age, from the history of salvation that was maybe the medieval mainstream view to conceive of a philosophy of history towards a self-conception of the age that was based on the loss of the guarantee of salvation, the loss of transcendence, the idea of a deus absconditus, the idea of a divine creation that was somehow left to itself. So this could be in a theological image, be conceived as a fallen nature, provoking a mood that's kind of sad and melancholic. And that also determines the artistic form of this epoch. So in secular terms, maybe we can forget for a moment these theological wordings. We pass from a philosophy of history that has a clear telos, like this is going to be the end of history in all of its dimensions of meaning, towards philosophy of immanence, where there's no goal and no outer reference point that assigns meaning to everything that's worldly. So that can be seen either as nature or as history, and these two poles can only assign meaning to the other pole and vice versa. And now Benjamin talks about, and this is a very interesting wording, the physiognomy of natural history. So that means that nature has a face, and that somehow you can read in this physiognomy. So it points to the fact of the readability of the world, the readability of nature. And in that sense of how, like, he's giving an instruction of how to read, or how, from this Baroque point of view, this nature as scripture can be read, and it can be read in the sense that history, historical time, immigrated into nature. So this is why the ruin is that important, why the rests on fragments of antique temples, etc., can be perceived as part of this nature, as part of this landscape, in the sense that there is some kind of time becoming spatial. So time can be perceived as something in space. And now I want to come to another quote, and then finish the comment by the antinomies of allegory. So Benjamin says that allegories, and it's a very nice metaphor, or allegory, allegories are in the realm of thought, what ruins are in the realm of things. So where the similarity resides is in, first of all, the perishability, the transitory character of both. So neither ruins nor allegories mean something out of themselves, but have to be assigned meaning from, the meaning has to be deposited in them. So that brings me to this antinomy that Benjamin states, that it's an antinomy between devaluation and revaluation. So you have on the one side devaluation, so the material things, the worldly things being has to be drained out of life. He also talks about Entseelung, so the soul has to be taken out of being in order to be the recipient for this meaning assigned to it by the allegorist. And then the revaluation would be in this elevating worldly, earthly, meaningless things into this higher realm of ideas and meaning. And I think I already used my 5 minutes, and I'm gonna leave the space to Daniel Gönitzer, please.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thanks also for the invitation. Can you hear me all right? Is the audio good? Okay. So I will try to summarize a little bit what we just heard, give a little bit of general ideas to Benjamin's term of allegory, and then end with another, I think, really crucial term in connection with the allegorical or the allegory, and that is melancholia. So as we heard in the first comment, Benjamin defines, or he doesn't really define it, but he speaks about allegory always in contrast to the symbol or symbolical. Thereby, he tries to deconstruct this antagonistic distinction between the symbol as a living or lively and the allegory as an inartistic and dead. So he's trying to subvert this strict distinction, I think. He then highlights the centrality of time and of temporal process in the functioning of allegory, as contrasted to the instantaneity of the symbol. Burkhard Lindner, a really important Benjamin scholar from Germany, describes Benjamin's usage of allegory as philosophical complex term, which stands for the, and I quote Lindner, destruction of veneer, so the destruction of the schönen Schein, and furthermore as an expression of melancholia. I also want to quote another Benjamin scholar, and this is Howard Island, who did the newest translation for Benjamin's book, because that's maybe a little interesting side note that Benjamin's book was first translated in 1977 from Peter Osborne, and 2019, so just a few years ago, there was this new translation. And in the introduction to this translation, Ireland says that the primary concern of Benjamin's study is actually the recovery of the idea of allegory. But thereby, he says, it's not just the redemption of allegory, but it's also the redemption of a literary genre. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but I think it's important that he focuses on this term of allegory, but it's not just this redemptional mode that he is trying to do. So in the center of Benjamin's reflection on allegory lies a certain preoccupation with death and the passage of time. We heard a little bit about it just now from Stephanie. So in other words, the experience of a radical estrangement from the past and tradition, as well as the draining of significance away from objects and of meaningful experience from life. And in this moment, I also want to mention that Benjamin was interested in allegory and allegorical, not only in the Trauerspielbuch, but also in his later studies on Charles Baudelaire and in his Arcades project. So there he thought about allegory in relation to the 19th century, what he did in the Trauerspielbuch in relation to the 17th century. So I think that's also an important note because he came back to this term. It's quite interesting, I think. And even after his engagement with Baudelaire, he also used the term a few times, especially in his writings on Franz Kafka and also in his texts on Charlie Chaplin's cinema. So what is the connection between all these examples? It's always like this engagement with fragmentation. So for Benjamin, the allegorist views the history as catastrophical in melancholy terms of silencing, dissolution, and decay. We had a little bit about this also. That's also the reason why the ruin becomes a quintessential allegoric emblem for him. In a similar way, the themes of death and especially martyrdom as ways of preparing the body for emblematic purposes are highlighted in Benjamin's discussion of the Baroque dramas. And I quote Benjamin, he writes in the Trauerspielbuch, characters die because it is only thus as corpses that they can enter into the homeland of allegory. So maybe, and that's also an idea I came to me while preparing, that the corpse can also be compared to the ruin. you could prolong the citation Stephanie gave us with the ruin for the realm of things, with the corpse in the realm of bodies and humans. So there we have like the same idea, I think. Consequently, the allegorist perceives the world as a fragmented and sees his tasks in the attempt to decipher it. Therefore, the allegorist proceeds by appropriating his imagery from the totality of its former context and attempts to reinterpret it, rather than restoring some original meaning that he had obscured or lost. So it's not just like this going back to the origin, but it's some kind of actualization, I think. And here we also have like a quite crucial connection to Benjamin's philosophy of history, I think, because here we have like the core, his core idea about his engagement with history. And for this task, Benjamin says the attitude of melancholy is crucial. And now I want to quote just 2 sentences from the Trauerspielbuch, where he speaks about the gaze of melancholy. Benjamin writes, if the object becomes allegorical under the gaze of melancholy, if melancholy causes life to flow out of it, and it remains behind dead, but eternally secure, then it is exposed to the allegorist, it is unconditionally in his power. That is to say, it is now quite incapable of emanating any meaning or significance of its own. Such significance as it has, it acquires from the allegorist. And then a few sentences later he writes, in his hands, so in the hands of the allegorist, the object becomes something different. Through it he speaks of something different, and for him it becomes a key to the realm of hidden knowledge. And I think especially the last part of this sentence, maybe it brings us back to the question Laurin poses regarding the functionality of the allegory. So it's not, I don't think that it's like in this direct sense that it's holds something like truth or like Wahrheit, but at least it holds like this key to the realm of hidden knowledge. But I would maybe add to this key, this allegoric key is still something like a puzzle. So it's always this engagement with this puzzling, with this reflection that's crucial for Benjamin for this for this key to the hidden knowledge. And I close with 2 more thoughts. When Benjamin writes that allegory is the preferred contemplative mode of melancholia that simultaneously empties and elevates the meaning of its object, that's something we just heard about also from Stephanie. And thus mourning and melancholia for Benjamin are not pre-existing capacities for paused contemplation. Rather, both should be understood as forms of attunement to the historical density of material surroundings. So only through the establishment of such relations with the world of objects is the melancholic capable of identifying and discerning that density. And I think that was also a little bit dense, but maybe we can clear up some of the terms in the discussion, and I'm really glad for comments and questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess the floor is now open for the audience.
Yeah, so thank you, Daniel and Steffi. Maybe just to say one more word about what this might be a connection between also the 2 emphases that you made between the melancholic and the ruin as to or the ruin as a metaphor for what is at stake here. Maybe a ruin that is that might also be interpreted as a place that is not just a derelict, but where the occupants have left. So a ruin is a place that might also be haunted. A ruin that where something is lost, something is absent, and that is expressing exactly this melancholia, this feeling of desire for something that has already left, and that is exactly probably what I was also talking about when I emphasized that the allegory has no foundation, that there is nothing that grants some kind of authority for this allegorical thinking. And this is also might be just exactly what is also meant when we are talking about melancholia for exactly these things that we cannot find we cannot uh, uh, revive the house again or rebuild the cathedrals of thought that we have demolished.
Okay, yeah, maybe we, I want to answer to Lauren at some point, but maybe we take some more questions first. Sebastian, I see a hand raised. Sebastian Kugler.
Thank you for these great comments on this chapter. When I was rereading it in preparation for this discussion, it really couldn't escape my mind how closely Benjamin ties his notion of allegory to the notion of writing in this chapter, and I wonder what your thoughts on this are. My thoughts would roughly be that coming from this critique of the art symbol or this classicist symbolist aesthetic of an unmediated presence of meaning, and this idea of allegory being an aesthetic mode of answering to a world that is kind of like hollowed out of transcendental meaning, that allegory becomes writing in the exact same way that it is writing is derided by those very same thinkers that deride allegory and favor the symbol. That's where he talks about Goethe and Schopenhauer, and it's very, very closely connected. I think it's a similar. I wonder if you agree with me. A very similar take that he has here with as Derrida does in his grammatology, where writing is, kind of like rehabilitated, not as something secondary to the unmediated presence of the spoken of the spoken word, and by that allegory becomes a much more productive way of signification and aesthetically more appealing and actually more apt in a way to express a certain historic experience than these metaphysics of presence that are working within the symbol or the spoken word.
Yeah, thank you. Saida, you also wanted to say something?
Yes, very briefly. I was wondering if the apories or aporias regarding allegories have to do with what Lauren said at the end concerning the possibility of assimilating ruin and allegory, because ruin is lack or absence, something missing, something sort of defective, and on the other hand, you, Steph, and Daniel were describing allegory as a means to densify meaning. So I don't know how to really understand what the function of allegory is, if on the one hand it represents sort of lack, and on the other enriches the meaning of another image or another or a concept. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay. Daniel, did you want to say something? I mean, I could start, but I saw that your hand was also raised. So if you have,
maybe you start, then I will follow.
okay, great. I will try to say some things that somehow attend to the three questions we heard, or the three comments we heard, as a reaction, because I think it maybe has to be made very, like, there's one connection that I find very important, and that has to be made very clear. So the critical potential of allegory, and this is why in Benjamin's text it's always transposed against the symbolic, is a denial or a negation of transfiguration of being itself. So what Benjamin calls Verklärung, being itself, being as just how it is, if you want, also with Benjaminian terms from another text, nude existence, mere being, cannot be seen as something that is already, has already realized its potential, or it cannot be idealized out of itself. So I think this is in many contexts very important. So it's the absence of false comfort, of false shine, the critical theory conception of shine, this transfiguration of being. So this absence of an ideal meaning can be answered, and there it gets a bit more complicated. In maybe, we can simplify it. It can be answered in two ways. Now, if there is no inner ideal meaning of being, then the subject able to assign meaning or produce meaning is either completely sovereign, completely free, and can be completely arbitrary in putting this, whatever meaning the subject wants, in this meaningless being, or it can be more attentive to the inner needs, or this, you called it, some of you called it loss, but so this absence can be conceived as a loss. So in a theological way of thinking, it's of course the loss of transcendence, of course the loss of God that abandoned creation. But in a secular way of thinking, this absence can also be read as the absence of a potential. So this redemptive moment is actually seeing this lack as something that has to be mended, that has to be repaired, that has to be completed, and then the allegorist, or this subject reacting to the impossibility of transfiguration, has to be more attentive of the needs of material itself, and then the combinatory mind of the allegorist somehow works in a different way. It doesn't work in this arbitrary way anymore, but it would put matter into a constellation, and from this constellation, some new meaning could be read out. So maybe just also to make clear why this is a reaction also to Sebastian's question about the notion of writing, because I think that there is a very it's a very dense and complicated treatment in Benjamin's text between the sound as something like a free expression of the creature, and this corset that writing imposes to matter again. And I think they can never, so the immediate cannot be just played out against the writing, but they have to somehow to work together. And I see, I'm just wanting to maybe make this clear. I think that writing is exactly this exercise of combining per se meaningless signs. So this is how your question also comes in, but I don't want to take too much time. Daniel, I think you wanted to react, and then maybe we hear Arturo's question or comments.
Yeah, maybe just a short note adding to this last thing you said, because I also wanted to say something to Sebastian's comment. But I have to ask a question first. When both of you speak about writing, you actually don't mean the act of writing, but the text, right? It's about the text, because in the German translation,
Schrift, but the Islands translation says writing.
Yes, exactly. Because I wanted to make this clear that it's not about the act of writing, but the text is. I think it's not the right thing to say, but it's about the Schrift. And I want to go back into the text just for one quote, where Benjamin makes a really, I think that's a really important, it's not a definition, but a really important summarization of this, what Sebastian said when he writes, allegory, as the following pages will demonstrate, is not a perfunctory illustrative technique, but expression. In German he says Ausdruck. As language is expression, as indeed writing is expression. So I think that's it's a really different, it's a difficult quote, I think, but I think it sums up like the crucial for Benjamin here, that it's like he makes this relation to language itself. So it's also like this, he kind of quotes his own texts on language as such, I think. So he also wants to bring in his whole theory of language into this term of the allegory, which is for him somehow more than just like this image. But maybe that's something I don't know if we still have time, but that's something which puzzles me, because it seems that the two things Saida mentioned, I think both of them are important. So it's like both. It's like this reflection of the loss, of the ruins, of the fragments of the past, but also like this functionality of I don't know, this new way of transporting knowledge in a sense, but maybe not knowledge, but more like experience for Benjamin. So I think like both of these functions for him are important for his idea of allegory, because we also have to always think of Benjamin's terms here. So it's not like a normal definition of allegory. Also, it's not like the normal understanding of melancholia, I think. But yeah, Arturo has a question or comment, please.
Arturo?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Just a very brief comment. Hi, how are you? Well, I don't know, I'm not very acquainted with text, but Stephanie said something very interesting about the idea of constellation. You know, if we are reading Benjamin in the context of political theology, I think well, at least that allegory should tend to be, or should be interpreted in political terms. So I try to make myself clear. I don't know. This is I submitted to your consideration, but I don't know if there is some relationship between allegory, metaphor, and constellation, because the whole point in, for example, the origin of the German Trauerspiel is something like ideas are the things as constellations are the stars. So what he's saying is that stars, ideas are not things in themselves. They're not the points. There's something emerging out of the points in the sky, which are called constellations. But constellations could be a form, I don't know if you would agree with that, a form of metaphor or figuration, if you will, because it's actually not there, but it makes something come out of the ground or out of a backdrop. But what Said is saying once and again is, what's the justification? And I think it's just political. That is, metaphors are valid, such as constellations, just in times of danger, and only if they open up the space for political intervention. It's not, for me, a metaphysical problem of completion or making possible to deal with the beyond of mere representation or appearance. It's something very practical and theological, practical, in the sense that it's just the moment of danger what makes figuration of history possible, and only in as much it makes some intervention possible. So the justification of metaphors in general, or if you will, of this general idea of constellation, like obtaining a gestalt, a figure of history, depends on the moment, depends on the very moment in which you are, because you are part of the constellation, and that's the only reason why you can see the history as if it had a direction, not because it has a direction in itself, such as Schmitt has said, but, and many others, because in the midst of immanence, there is something called justice that gives direction, and that is read in the constellation through some metaphorical reading. But these are just loose ideas. But thank you very much. Thank you all for your very stimulating presentations.
Okay, thank you. A little bit watching the time. We should, if it's okay for everyone, pass to the next text and maybe come back to what you said in the final discussion or in one of the discussions of the other texts. So the next author we are treating now is Roland Barthes. We had some sections from mythologies, and Rainer Stummer, who is responsible for commenting on that text, gave us 3 little pieces of beautiful myths of Barthes that we will now hear something about it. Rainer, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, so thanks again for inviting me to the workshop and this great speed dating of metaphors. It's really exciting. From the list of literature that was agreed upon, I decided to choose Roland Barthes' mythologies, and I'm glad because it was fun picking out the myths I personally like, which are Wie Paris nicht unterging, or As How Paris Did Not Sink, der vom Streik betroffene Bürger, or The Strike-Bound Citizen, and Plastic. I chose those 3 because of what I felt was a nice relation to contemporary debates, problems, and crises, as Barthes' account of flooding of Paris nicely dovetails with the devastating flooding of Austria just 2 weeks before the election, which took place yesterday. as the musings about the strike-bound citizen felt very up-to-date in relation to, for example, the protests of groups like Extinction Rebellion and Last Generation, and the reaction to them. And lastly, the myth of plastic and its supposed perfect variability, with which I think Barthes himself is taken by a myth. The myth Barthes contests is speech, but not any kind of speech. It is a form, a produced meaning as opposed to substance. The myth has no boundaries. Anything, as soon as it enters the realm of discourse, can become mythified in order to fulfill a specific social use, notwithstanding its material substrate. But, and this is the crucial point, the myth is the moment in which this produced meaning, this history, is confused with naturality or matter-of-factness, to speak with Latour. A starting point of Barthes' mythology is a discomfort with this matter-of-factness that, as Barthes says, carries false evidences in its depiction of, again, Latourian matters of concern or Streitsachen as matter of course, Selbstverständlichkeiten, or in other words, of the historical as natural. Mythization as speech consists of two movements then. First, an act of naming, which identifies social entities, such as the riders of the Tour de France, with natural essences, such as elegance, fortitude, or bravado. And as a second step, a denaming or Entnennung that takes place, which obscures the sovereign act of naming, of meaning production, and instead foregrounds the struggle between what is now perceived as fixed, natural essences instead of socially constructed meanings. The order of the world, Barthes writes, shall suffice in itself or be unspeakable, but it shall never mean. Sie soll niemals bedeuten. The bourgeois project of the domination of nature, the idea that nature would behave according to the will of the sovereign ego cogito, when juxtaposed with the bourgeois project of political hegemony, creates a society which behaves as the exact flip side to a changeable nature. It is ossified, unmoving, characterized by transformation from anti-nature to pseudo-nature. This is, I think, why a term such as myth or mythology, which usually describes a speech or story that is fabled or fantastic, serves as a metaphor here. And this is as far as I would like to go with my preliminary remarks. And now very shortly regarding the three selected myths, I chose how Paris did not sink because of the recent floodings, as I said. But notice how the title, How Paris Did Not Sink, and it is how Paris did not sink and not when Paris did not sink, or als Paris nicht unterging, because how points towards a function of the myth and not toward that one time when Paris did not sink. The myth here might be reusable, and indeed I would argue that the myth is evoked right in that moment when the idea of the domination of nature is most thoroughly disturbed, when floods appear as an outside to the social that warrant the closing of ranks, or as Barthes writes, the building of an ark. The ark, he writes, is a happy myth. Humanity gains distance from the elements, assembles in it, and develops the necessary consciousness of its powers, and exactly in disaster finds the evidence for the possibility of world domination. One question I would like to propose in this regard would be, could we, instead of finding the evidence for the possibility of world domination and just doubling down on it, not also retrieve a sense for the changeability of society in the face of natural catastrophe? When contemporary climate science clearly indicates that nature does mean, does the waning grip of the environment not motivate the trial of new forms of living and surviving? Or in other words, does this particular myth still stand a chance vis-a-vis climate science and climate politics? The strike-bound citizen explores a similar relation. Here it is not so much the entanglement of society and nature that is at this position, but the constitutive relatedness of humans within society and solidarity between them. In order to be able to hold ideologies such as that there is no such thing as society, the strike-bound citizen as a rhetorical figure is created to uphold a logical separation between otherwise constitutively related people. Barthes criticizes a bourgeois understanding of the sovereign act based on an atomized individuality whose logic is disturbed in the moment of the strike, when it becomes evident that citizens depend on other citizens. Protests such as those of the Extinction Rebellion and Last Generation, who glued themselves to the road in order to disrupt fossil fuel business as usual, have received strong critiques and evoked a lot of violence. The claim that these protests are radical itself has been radicalized to the point that its participants are heavily criminalized. Have these protests unwillingly reproduced the logic of the strike-bound citizen and upheld the myth instead of demythified it? And finally, in the preface, Barthes hints at the possibility of the mythologist creating his or her own mythologies. And this is, I think, what happens in plastic, where Barthes describes the use of plastic as magical operation par excellence. On the one end of the molding machine, a telluric, earthen, raw material, on the other, the perfect human-made object, and nothing in between. All materiality or material inherent recalcitrance is lost. Its fragilism is total. But does Barthes not overlook something? Does not some part of the process of molding plastic take place before the machine and therefore outside of Barthes' horizon? Does not plastic have to be rendered plastic by preparation, by extracting crude oil, refining it in elaborate processes, making it into granulate, packing that granulate in bags and boxes and shipping it across the world, just as the famous Leopoldi Fregoli probably has had to rehearse his stage act frequently and exhaustingly. How would Fregoli himself talk about the labor of metamorphosis? Yeah, so the overall political question I think I would ask everyone here is then, if the metaphor of the myth allows for a deciphering of a pseudo-nature as history, is this, and looking at the selected myths, is enabling demythification and even conducting demythification enough? Does the metaphor enable enough? That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, Rainer, thank you so much. That was a great tour de force through Roland Barthes' theory of myths. Questions and comments to mythologies?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rainer. I I really found this interpretation of the plastic very interesting, and maybe you could expand a little bit on that last thought, especially regarding the multiplicity of forms. And as you also said, this domination and plastic allows us that power of casting everything into all forms of our willing against, again, also this feeling of being haunted by plastic when we are confronted with the ever-growing Pacific plastic vortex and plastic as an omnipresent material in our everyday lives, and in what way plastic is itself maybe a powerful metaphor for that could also be utilized politically in our times.
Yeah, thank you. So
can I propose that we collect maybe? So Daniel has another comment. And I would put myself into the queue as well.
Okay, but yeah, it's on something really different, but I can ask the question now because I was also interested in this text about Paris and the flood, and actually on the first page already I found a sentence which really interested me. It's about the how do you say it, about the changing of the daily optic through the flood, like this changing of perception, which very much reminded me also of Benjamin, of course, with his thoughts about the optical unconsciousness, so like the change of perception of nature through new media technologies. And now we have here, but the changing of perception through like a natural disaster, which I think is a crazy thought actually, but I really liked it. And then he even uses the term entstellt. I don't know the English translation, sorry, but maybe you can say something about this Entstellung through like this natural disaster and its connection to this. I don't know if you can also connect it to metaphors, but in a way it's also a thought about, I don't know, a new ways of transporting knowledge or experience. So I think it's like in close relationship to question of metaphors.
Entstellung is, I think, usually translated with disfigurement. I would add maybe a few thoughts or questions, because I found it very. On the one hand, I thank you so much for your presentation, and I continue, like while reading it and also listening to you, I found the parallels to Benjamin's allegory quite striking. In this, there is always a metamorphosis. Like it never. There is something like a rhythm of allegorization. Also here, there's a transformation from one meaning to the next. So a bit more specifically, but it has to do with this movement. I wanted to ask you about the concept of function, like where you see the role of function, because in the like thinking of two of the image of the small pieces, the inundation of Paris, the myth seems to come into play first of all as liberating things from their function. So he talks about, the little houses that if you look from a bird's eye view now look completely different inside of these masses of water, and no one could really recognize anymore what their function once was, or the things that float around in the water. So somehow the things are freed or liberated from their function, from their being tied or enslaved by a function or by a use. And then there's this second step where myth enters these once liberated things again by using them as a staging of this enemy conception of nature. So nature now is our enemy, and we're building the barricades to defend ourselves from this enemy. So there's always these steps, and function here function is left behind like at the beginning, but then in plastic function is like has the last word. No, and there are also kind of a series of metamorphoses, and at the last sentence, it seems that I have it in only in German. Plastik geht ganz in seinem Gebrauch auf. So the myth that takes possession of plastic is its function itself. Like its only function, it's only this adaptability and substitutability, and there is no other meaning of plastic at all that it could have been freed from, because it's like ends up in this in just meaning its function. Yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to, oh my God, those are a lot of questions. I will try to just continue with your last thought there, because I think this is exactly what I meant, why I believe that Barthes, with his description of what plastic is or does, is himself, taken by a myth, because I don't know, I just don't buy it that there is no other function in plastic than its use, like no other meaning. As I said, it comes from somewhere, it has to be prepared somehow by someone. There is labor involved. So I think the myth is, that plastic is such a material that has this absence of a function, or of a meaning, when well, how to put it now, when plastic probably serves, or maybe could be like this description of plastic, in my eyes, serves a certain ideology of, for example, how it is always said that companies who sell water don't really sell water, but they sell plastic bottles. That's, so it just serves this function of producing endless stuff, but it is not so much that the material itself has this meaninglessness, endlessness, or whatever. Like, it comes from somewhere. So and going a little bit further back, yeah, the concept of the function itself. Yeah, maybe the myth comes into play as liberating things from their function. Maybe it also, it's not so much the things that are liberated from their function, but their multiplicity of functions, right? So like Laurin already hinted at, I'm gonna go further back then. So, and maybe this creating of unambiguousness, of getting away this whole multiplicity and reducing the use to one use case, to be clear about everything, to know what to do, serves a certain ability to act. That would make a lot of sense to me, at least. Yeah, so and to plastic, to the multiplicity of forms, and like where I was coming from with this. I didn't say it that explicitly, but yeah, I would, like, again, to the materiality of plastic and how it's floating around in the oceans. I think it's one of the, I believe, 7 boundaries of the Earth. All the stuff that is floating around in nature and kind of disrupting other things such as biodiversity. So that there is definitely, this, I call it recalcitrance to all these things. The theoretical reference that I had here is Katie Lloyd Thomas. She is like a like an architecture theorist who doesn't write about plastic, but about concrete, which is my favorite topic. And she would describe also concrete as that it is usually perceived to be like this perfectly moldable material, liquid stone, you pour it into a cast of whatever shape you like, and then it comes out and it's perfect and it's done and it holds forever. With a and she then looked like intensively into the practices of in situ concrete casting, meaning creating a mold and pouring the concrete like at the construction site. And people who are in that line of work have to have a lot of knowledge how to prepare the cast, the concrete, and like in order for the concrete to do what they want it to do, how it settles, the temperature has to be right. There is additives that make it dry faster or slower. There is concrete that can dry underwater, so there is a lot of preparations that have to be taken. And Katie Lloyd Thomas in turn comes from Simondon, whose first name is, I think, Gilbert, who also has this like 50-page long description of clay bricks and how the clay has to be prepared like in a really long process in order to be moldable into something as simple as a brick. So yeah, and I think the same holds true for plastic, and that's why I don't buy Roland Barthes' description. And I think he like falls prey maybe a little bit to this whole myth of we found the perfect material that we can do anything with. I think he writes like the whole world will be plasticized or something. Which, as Lauren said, well, it happens, but not as we thought. It's just now plastic that swims around in the ocean. That I guess that's not what Barth had in mind. Yeah, and yeah, regarding the flooding and the changing of perception of nature through disaster, yeah, well, I can't say so much about the term of Entstellung. When you mentioned the word, I was reminded of something that I once heard Steffi give a presentation about. And because I think the flood right now, I wouldn't so much view it as Entstellung, but maybe more even as a revealing kind of thing. And maybe into like something that happens within a process, like an oscillation between Gestaltung and Entstaltung, which is my reference to Steffina. So it is not like a complete destruction of how we might have perceived nature to be before that flood, but maybe, like a reiteration of how things happen upon us, like how these natural catastrophes are maybe attributable to social behavior, and how in the end social behavior has to adapt towards a maybe a new intensity of these events. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I would love to jump in to continue talking about entstellte nature, disfigured nature, and the original or not original nature we can or not go back to. But I think it's quite late already and we all need a break. So I would propose that we just take 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone, so we can conclude the second session also more or less punctually. Okay? Okay, see you in 5. Hallo Andreas, wir sind gerade in einer Pause. Schön, dass du da bist. Wir sind noch eine Minute in einer Pause.
So, es ist leider heute ein sehr, sehr dichter, sehr bewegter Tag. Wie war die Diskussion bisher?
War gut bis jetzt. Also sehr, sehr schnell, sehr getaktet, aber auf jeden Fall spannend.
Ich habe jetzt keine Ahnung, wie bisher die Diskussionen überhaupt verlaufen sind, leider dadurch. Also wie gesagt, nachdem ich beide Kinder jetzt habe, war es so, dass ich jetzt gerade erst zurückgekommen bin.
Das ist okay. Also eben, wir machen es immer so.
Recording. Sorry.
Hi.
Hi. No, I just wanted to.
I just, yeah, we speak English and we will explain whatever's going to happen. So,
Sorry.
leider. No, nothing. I just let you explain the.
Okay, no,
course of the.
I was just saying that there's a recording of the previous presentations. So.
Okay, it's excellent. So that means I can eventually also access the previous recordings. Yeah.
So I stopped the recording precisely during the pause, but I think I'm going to restart it again. Should we wait like 1 minute more until everybody joins again?
Maybe just for Andreas off the record, we have normally a 5 minutes comment on that everyone shows. Oh, you're here twice.
Yeah, I'm logging out here and I'm using the other. Okay.
Okay. So in the comments should be kept to five minutes, maximum 7 minutes, and then we open the discussion.
Okay, so maybe we should start, right?
Okay, sorry, Steffi, could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I just explained that we have a comment 5 to maximum 7 minutes to the sections everyone chose, and then we open up the discussion to everyone, and we pose questions that can be answered either by the commentator or whoever feels responsible to answer.
Okay, ready? Hello again to all of you. We are going to start our the second part of this meeting on metaphors, on the epistemic value and political value of metaphors. Now we will comment on the introduction to Blumenberg's paradigms to metaphorology, and we will have Miranda Bonfil and myself presenting that text. So without further ado, Miranda, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for organizing this workshop. I'm very excited. Well, this is a bit of a thick text, and I don't want to reconstruct the whole thing, but mainly try to just reconstruct a little bit the main argument and then go into a couple of questions that have to do with the epistemological and political implications of what Blumenberg is saying. This text was published in 1960, and it's a dialogue with the people doing Begriffsgeschichte. And this is important because at the beginning, what seems to be merely a methodological precision or a methodological advice ends up actually subverting the logic of most of the research that's being done with concepts. I think that what the starting point of this is saying that Begriffsgeschichte is insufficient because although concepts presuppose a horizon in which although concepts build systematic formations for knowledge, they presuppose a horizon in which they unfold. And for this reason, no conceptual history can actually account for what is truly important. And this is the floor that is the nourishing solution from which these concepts take their shape. And this is the place where the problem of the metaphor arises. Before going straight into the topic of the metaphor, maybe there's two other pairs of opposites besides the opposition between metaphor and concept. It's not necessarily an opposition, but it's a tense relationship. And this is very important for what Blumenberg will later develop on writings where he addresses, let's say, more explicitly the problem of the political. These oppositions are the modern distinction that are symbolized by the pair Descartes-Vico, where the problem that is being thematized is the problem of the relationship of fantasy and knowledge. On the one side, a thinker that scratches out fantasy to the realm of the not desirable, and on the other hand, Vico trying to explain let's say, like the important role of fantasy in order to build any kind of knowledge, where the man can only truly know the things that he himself has created. Standing on the side of Vico, Blumenberg here is defending the imagination as the catalytic sphere of any logical construct, let's say. The second opposition that it's important in this construction, it's maybe this one between Plato and the Sophists, where what Blumenberg is trying to savage is the role of rhetoric in the way in which the human being relates to its environment. This opposition, the second opposition, is fundamental, I think, for the political implications of Blumenberg's project. The question is why and how can metaphors be legitimate for philosophy? How can they not be inauthentic? And for this, the basic supposition is that metaphors are elements that operate at the base of any conceptual language, and therefore, in order to have any kind of logical articulation of reality, you need these basic images that are, let's say, establishing a pragmatical orientation where there's no conceptual or logical content that can be derived. These images come when questions that are not answerable enter the room. So what is the world? What is the truth? What is time? And giving the impossibility of logically closing these questions, then images come. These metaphors, this transference of meaning from one realm to another have to enter. The value of these metaphors is that they have a pragmatic function. It's not a relationship towards truth, but it's a relationship towards action. They have the virtue of alleviating the discomfort produced by a threatening reality that cannot be conceptually resolved, and they, let's say, create a regulatory field that precedes conceptual formation but can never be fully solved through concepts or through logic. I think this is quite a hit towards not only a rationalist view of the world, but also to how conceptual history is done. I would like now to go to two implications that I think would be very interesting to discuss in light of what has been already said. The first one is the epistemological implication that it's logically impossible to reach an end state of philosophy because knowledge is built on conceptual structures that always have a blind spot. So basically all philosophical constructs are boats built on provisory answers. And the history of these provisory answers, it's what is showing what he calls the metakinesis of historical horizons of meaning. The problem here, and this is what I wanted to hint at the beginning, is that these metaphors are most of the time very hard to grasp. And when Blumenberg does the analysis, he always moves in these high spheres of philosophical reflection. And even though he poses the question of the criteria by which absolute metaphors may be ascertained, may be defined, this proves very complicated when we're not referring only to the big names, the big authors, the big metaphors that kind of inform philosophical thought, but he fails most of the time to take into account, even though it's presupposed that these metaphors are not only in the thought, but are also regulating actions and behaviors in the world. There's a tension between the ways in which these metaphors operate, let's say, in common life and the way in which operate in theory. And I think that's something that can be through other ways maybe bridged, but that it's a problem for this particular elaboration. And then the second point is the political implications, which Blumenberg mostly tries to avoid. He's not a very explicit political writer. There is, though, three or four exceptions to this. Most of it writings that he didn't publish while he was alive, and that are drawn from the Nachlass. The one that I would like to raise here, it's not the one dealing with political myth. That is probably the most famous one. It's called Prefiguration. But the important one here, and it's important because it's drawing on this defense of sophism, is the concept of reality and theory of state, where this defense of the sophistic tradition leads him to have a discussion with Schmitt. Here, what he's trying to defend is that politics in the modern world cannot be understood as politics as decisions, but that the only way in which humankind and the world can sustain themselves is by looking at state politics as rhetorics. And this is because words would be, in the atomic age, the only way in which conflict can be postponed. It would be the only way in which survival of the world is possible, and therefore the only legitimate political means. I think this is very interesting because it's basically a negation of politics, or of the traditional idea of politics as a place where humans can exercise freedom, can develop a world. It's an anti-utopian view of politics, where the only thing that is left to protect is the survival and the not erasing of the world. which is quite, it contrasts a lot with other authors that we have here today. So yeah, I think that those would be my two points.
Thank you, Miranda. I will present the same text, making also reference to other Blumenberg's works. And let's see, how can we discuss this later? So, the introduction to Blumenberg's groundbreaking paradox or metaphorology might be considered a manifesto. It is a dense text, as Miranda just reminded us, that includes several fundamental theses supporting Blumenberg's project of a historical, in a phenomenological sense, analysis of absolute metaphors in the history of Western philosophy, but also, as Miranda just reminded us as well, in politics, which is a very restricted area of Blumenberg's writings, at least the published ones. Some fundamental subjects suggested in this text are: 1, the interpretation against the canonic view concerning metaphors; 2, a wink to Koselleck's project of a conceptual history, and to the incompleteness of such a project if it lacks a history of metaphors; and 3, and most importantly here, the positive assessment concerning the epistemological value of metaphors and their relation to concepts. I will comment on these 3 points. A Cartesian utopia would be similar to what Blumenberg depicts in the first paragraphs: hypothetical scenario in which clear and non-ambiguous language triumphed over confusion, improper language, and lack of precision. Clarity and distinction in concepts would lead to perfect and adequate definitions. But the triumph of proper language, of exact presence and perfection, would lead to the abolition of historicity. Beyond the fact that there would be an agreement between peer philosophers and no need to change definitions, and from the fact that we would get rid of what Blumenberg calls the diverse and opaque burden of tradition, there would also be no need for other linguistic resources to enrich or densify an idea. The description of an utopic scenario serves Blumenberg to contrast the Cartesian thesis, which I will call the exclusive thesis, in which language is a restricted domain of proper references that rejects improper utterances, with the inclusive thesis, according to which the logical sphere is broader and includes different sorts of logics. The Cartesian scenario is utopic precisely because, according to Blumenberg, and also to a long tradition that goes back to Vico, the logical sphere, the sphere of logos, has different levels of production of representations and different logics, not only the conceptual one. Appealing to a geological metaphor, we can say that language has strata, logical layers of sense whose boundaries are not clearly determined. Blumenberg contrasts the Cartesian scenario to Vico's acknowledgement of the role of fantasy in human discursivity, and draws attention to the logic implicit within. The logic of fantasy implies the movements of transference proper to metaphors. He defends Vico's idea that metaphors are not outside the sphere of proper language. They are not situated in the universe of defective language. Rather, metaphors are understood as having some logic, meaningful epistemological value, and a meaningful enunciative role in philosophical discourses. For him, as we know, this is the first level of analysis of all conceptual history. Let us remember that this was his position regarding Koselleck's project. Before analyzing the history of concepts, it is necessary to study the fundamental ground from which concepts extract meaning and persuasive force. Metaphorology is not for Blumenberg something related to critic reflection, a kritische Reflexion, That is the analysis of the presence of what, from the Cartesian perspective, is called the impure elements in philosophy. Blumenberg adds another epistemic determination to metaphors. Metaphors will not only be understood as cases occurring within the logical sphere, which is one of his main points, they are also strongly related to truth. He summarizes in some lines the importance of the history of rhetoric and persuasion, the relation between truth and form, not just content, in ancient Greece, and the history of their progressive differentiation. Blumenberg's metaphorological project can be understood as an endeavor to recover the ancient relation between persuasion and truth, and the need to go back to this idea as a guiding line, allowing for analyzing the epistemic role of metaphors in philosophical discourses. Since metaphors, like conceptual thought, are linked to truth and to the historicity of language, inasmuch as language is a layered dimension of the human production of his world of life, or Lebenswelt, he also understands his project as a sort of complement to conceptual history. Conceptual history is mistaken if it takes for granted that metaphoric discourse is a deficient, insufficient, or primitive vestige of mythical thought within logos. Between these lines, it is possible to perceive Blumenberg's thesis developed in the theory of aconceptuality. To be sure, there is a relation between myth and metaphor. However, both myth and metaphor are not defective forms and expressions of thought. They are related through a logic of fantasy. The epistemic role of fantasy can also be asserted from the anthropological point of view, which is absent from paradigms, but helpful to consider since it allows us to understand better why metaphors and concepts are not so strongly differentiated. They are both instruments that control what Blumenberg calls the absolutism of reality. Just as from the anthropological point of view, metaphors and concepts are two rational instruments to overcome incomprehension, from an epistemological point of view, they work together to produce truth. Philosophical discourse is an amalgam of metaphors and concepts. Some metaphors, absolute metaphors, are fundamental to philosophical language. Blumenberg acknowledged the importance of the productive chain of language formulated by Pico, but also by Herder or Nietzsche. Generally speaking, in this genetic explanation of the origin of the linguistic sign, signs, words, or concepts are the last result of progressive abstraction. Each faculty intervenes with some abstractive activity until a word is born and can behave independently from what it refers to at the sensible level. But in addition, following Vico and also an unexpected Kant, Blumenberg will try to consider fantasy in its own particularity. He considers that fantasy must not be taken as a hidden art lost in the abysses of our minds, as Kant would have it in the first critique. He would instead take Kant's own words from the third critique. He assumes that fantasy, as the source of the production of symbols, is a theoretical domain that produces essential access to knowledge of ideas that cannot be conceptualized. Blumenberg takes the example Kant himself gives of the state and the machine, and I quote, "The metaphor of the machine, when applied to the state, signifies that between a despotic state and a handmill, there is of course no similarity, but there is one between the rule for reflecting on both and their causality." End of the quote of the third critique. But Blumenberg continues. Immediately following this example, there appears the sentence that provided the initial stimulus for the present study. "This business has yet been little discussed, much as it deserves a deeper investigation. End of quote. Blumenberg's metaphorology has at its ground the assumption according to which the former step before the construction of linguistic sign, that is, fantasy and its symbols, is a source of production of a sort of cognitive material that the concept will take up, or from which the concept will be nourished, so to say. To state the former means to invert the common association that makes a metaphor an effective element lacking thought in favor of the idea that it is instead the concept that lacks something and must nourish from metaphors. However, this nutrition does not mean the destruction of the source of images, as a physiological metaphor of consumption or assimilation might suggest. Fantasy, as this nutritional ground of symbolic logic, is tireless. As he calls it, it is a catalytic sphere, as Miranda just reminded us as well, that triggers the possibility of knowledge. Now, the main difference between what he calls rudimental metaphors and absolute metaphors is that this absolute metaphors cannot be dissolved into conceptuality. They have been resisting images that have reappeared in philosophical language throughout the history of philosophy. The definition of these metaphors shows to what extent Blumenberg is convinced of this tireless source, irreducible to concepts, which their own logic of production and susceptible to history. The metaphoric layer of thought exists in its own right. It is not a defect of thought, but a permanent source of symbolic resources to complement conceptual thought. Therefore, metaphorology is a sort of archaeology of resistant images that runs throughout philosophical Western thought. Thank you. So yeah, I'm the moderator as well. I need to ask you if you have any questions. Please raise the little hand so I can see the order. Cesar?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Well, my question for both of you is about the next. As Miranda said at the very beginning of her intervention, one of the main questions here about metaphorology is how can we find the criteria for to know which metaphors are legitimate, about the legitimacy of metaphors, which can we consider as, I don't know.
Oh, there you are.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think the network isn't very stable. Okay. I was saying that here the question is about the limits, or we're looking for criteria to recognize legitimate metaphors. Well, so but maybe when we are asking these kind of questions, we're thinking about a very epistemological criteria, and maybe well, I'm thinking that when we put this question, maybe we are looking for a permanent criteria to define or to recognize the legitimacy of metaphors, but maybe maybe that could be a mistake, because maybe what metaphors do is to build every time their own rules. Maybe a metaphor builds its own rules, and then another metaphor builds its own rules, and so on. So maybe there is no such thing as a universal and permanent criteria to recognize this. And I am thinking that maybe we are choosing the wrong model, because maybe we're thinking about science and epistemological criteria, but what another instance that builds every time its own criteria is art. So maybe we should look for the way art produces truth, with its own and different rules every time. Of course, I'm thinking about Gadamer. I'm not saying that, of course, for Gadamer, art is a way of truth, of historical truth. And maybe something similar is happening here with metaphors. Maybe it's not a matter of science. Maybe it's not an epistemological matter in the hard sense of the word. And I am thinking about the notion from Wittgenstein of game languages. You know that for Wittgenstein, for the second Wittgenstein, there is no such thing as an essence or substance in the language, but there are these games, these relationships, referential relationships between terms and so on. So I don't know, what do you think about this? Maybe the art, maybe the notion of game could lead us to a different way to think about metaphors. I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, thank you. If anyone wants to ask another question, this is the moment, because we are gathering questions, and then we will answer, and then we have to go to. Yes, Andreas.
Hi, thanks for the two presentations. A very quick and very general question. What chances do you see to combine or to somehow create a conversation between the archaeology of Michel Foucault and Hans Blumenberg? So what kind, or even that of Derrida, what kind of archaeologies could be combined, taking into consideration also Blumenberg's work?
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? So, okay, let's move to answers. Miranda, do you want to start?
Yeah, I have a better answer for the first one than for the second one. But I would say that what Cesar just asked, it's the problem. I would say it's not so much on whether there are good or bad metaphors, but because he's focusing on history of philosophy. He's not trying himself to build a philosophical system through metaphors, but he's trying to understand how the transformation of systems of knowledge functions. What is the dynamic? How can you understand this basically the modern break? That's the question that it's behind all these elaborations. Is how can you understand this complete inversion in horizons of meaning that do not come necessarily from the conceptual level, but from the images upon which these systems are built. So what I would say is that he's not trying to evaluate if a metaphor is useful or not useful, but how does it present itself in a certain moment of history. And the problem here is to define whether this metaphor is absolute or is not absolute. This is a very problematic thing, because by describing this categorical means, well, you have superficial metaphors and you have absolute metaphors. But when you are trying to define, to understand whether a certain metaphor is really operating as this image upon which a systematic building is working, it gets very tricky. Although this last suggestion, I do think that they impose a certain game logic. This I would agree upon. They do make a field, let's say, and this field comes with its own rules. So I would agree with the last thing. And the funny thing is that this text was also published on the same year that Truth and Method was published. So that's also.
I was also thinking about that. Even I was about to question about Gadamer, but that is for another time.
Maybe you want to take the second one, Saida?
Yes, I also want to mention something concerning this Gadamer presence here, because Gadamer was Koselleck's teacher. So they were having, Koselleck, Blumenberg, were having a discussion on what is the reason to dismiss a history of metaphors in this dictionary Koselleck was planning. And Koselleck was thinking through the light of Gadamer's conception of historicity. That's why Blumenberg can also be related to a phenomenological conception of historicity. So Gadamer is there. There's a strong presence, but I think in a negative way, like someone, and Koselleck is also there, a group of thinkers who's not thinking enough the meaning of this grounding floor for conceptuality. So that's something concerning Gadamer. I also wanted to say that the questions you're raising are important, but it's also important to make some distinctions concerning what metaphorology is doing or what it's about. It's sort of a method to analyze from an historical point of view what metaphors, what metaphors brought to conceptual thinking in the history of philosophy. So it's an analysis of something that was already created, so to say, and already used and already practiced. So on that respect, metaphorology is not a domain, a philosophical domain, to say how to do things with metaphors, but how to analyze metaphors in the philosophical discourse. But on the other hand, this methodological interest implies a definition of a metaphor, of course, and how you can bring metaphors into the conceptual, how it is important to consider the presence of metaphors within the construction of truth. And yeah, that's, let's say, something that you can ask Blumenberg as well. And there's also another question which leads us to the political aspect of metaphors, which is what do we do in politics with metaphors? But this question is not what metaphors are, but rather how can we analyze metaphors? And I think one assumption is that you cannot just propose metaphors in the political sphere or in the philosophical sphere. Metaphors are related to the forms of life, so to say. You just not invent metaphors, as you just not invent political myths. You cannot because you want to create a myth out of the blue, so to say. I think for Blumenberg, myths and metaphors are already or participate from a Lebenswelt, and you cannot overlook that aspect. And concerning Andrea's question, well, I think there is a strong relationship. I mean, it's a sort of a similar methodological question and methodological assumptions. But I think there's one main difference. This is the first time I really reflect on that. There's a very tricky aspect in Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, which is the concept of episteme, which you cannot really, or for which Foucault never really supplied a satisfactory definition. So what is an episteme, and how can you determine the limits of an episteme and of utterance within it? And I think Blumenberg is not, at least as far as I can see, he's not thinking about a pre-existence of an episteme. He's rather thinking, as I already mentioned, as Lebenswelt, like forms of life, which are not necessarily, you don't need to necessarily define them in their limits. Yeah, I think the difference is a question of how to understand the space within which an utterance or a metaphor is born, so to say, or is meaningless, or meaningful, sorry, or meaningless as well. And I think they both would have different answers to that question, because, as I said, Blumenberg is thinking through the light of the phenomenological concept of Lebenswelt. But I don't know if this is enough to understand a strong difference between them.
I would add something maybe to that, just that it's on what Blumenberg is proposing. It's undoable with the it's a question also of sources. The sources are completely different, and this is something that I was hinting at the beginning, that it's that with Blumenberg it's very difficult to work with other than just a selection of authors, of very famous authors, or literary works or philosophical works, trying to do this kind of metaphorological approach with the kind of archive work that Foucault does would be humanly impossible, I would say. It's also a lot less systematic. There's a lot. It's trying to present a sketch of something that it's distinguishable, but it's not necessarily fixated as a centrum. It's not so systematic, I would say. But I think it would be very interesting to see something that tries to combine both, because I see elements that one has that the other one is lacking. And even though there's no, I don't think there was any contact. This French-German divide is quite strong. I think it would be very interesting to see something trying to build a bridge.
Okay, due to time, we have to go to our next panel. So we are now listening to comments on the nomos of the earth, Carl Schmitt text, and comments from Andreas Oberprangtacher, Cesar Pineda, and Arturo Romero. Please go ahead.
So should I go first?
Please.
So first of all, thank you so much for organizing this and for making this encounter possible. And please do also excuse that I'm currently kind of trying to juggle different obligations at once, as you have already seen. My kids are with me, which is because I'm a full-time father for the entire week. And here we are slowly approaching bedtime, and they haven't eaten yet. So it's I'm quite in a tricky position at this moment. At the same time, I'm also in a tricky position because unlike most of you, I don't have a kind of a fully elaborated theory that I could present here. So it will really be a very spontaneous comment. But methodologically speaking, this brings me already to the first problem. How do you comment a corollary? How do you comment already a text that understands itself as a comment to something? Because one of the texts that I would say is quite relevant for understanding the nomos of the earth is one of the first corollaries, which is already condensing, to my opinion, a number of arguments which are a combination of metaphorological assumptions and which perhaps could also hold some of the keys to understand what is happening here. I would also like to start with some preoccupations that have to do very much with my own readings of Schmitt. To the extent that Schmitt is very much present among many of the contemporary ultra-extremist populist movements, especially when it comes to migration and all fantasy related to some kind of autochthony. I think in order to understand what is happening here and to what extent this ultra-extremist populist movements are able to capture some sentiments and to make use of these sentiments, it is, or it can be quite relevant to indeed return to Schmitt. Another reason is that I do also think that beyond and besides these populist movements, the way border regimes function in general has to do with, or very often has to do with fantasies that cannot be reduced to a form of rationalist governance, but where I would argue we do encounter between the lines a lot of sexualized fantasies. And this brings me also to my main argument. My main argument is that perhaps a metaphorological reading of the nomos of the earth should perhaps not start with the all too obvious that we encounter here a great many naturalistic fallacies that Schmitt argues on the ground of earthly fantasy or a natural landscape that can never be translated into a political paradigm. I think that the problem, or perhaps another kind of a problem of Schmitt's argument has much more to do with that, what I would call here, and I'm choosing my words carefully, a wet fantasy. So it is really a wet fantasy, and not just in the sense that this archetypical opposition of the land on the one hand and the sea on the other hand, but it is also a wet fantasy because the whole text or the whole corollary transpires a lot of sexual fantasies. This starts already with the first sentence in German, that die Earth or die Erde wird in mythischer Sprache die Mutter des Rechts genannt. The earth in mythical language is called the mother of law. On the one hand, in philological terms, this is also a strong indicator that Schmitt has been an avid reader of the theories of Bachhofen. You are probably familiar with Bachhofen as this problematic figure of the late 19th century, which promoted a first matriarchal theory by arguing that all patriarchies were preceded by a matriarchy. So on the one hand, he is often being used as a thinker that for the first time ever tried to develop arguments in favor of matriarchies. But actually, I think that Bachhofen, to whom Schmitt refers to, is very much a thinker of patriarchal models. And we see a certain continuation also in the work of Schmitt. Apart from the fact that the entire corollary, but also the entire epos, the nomos of the earth, makes repeatedly reference to the work of literature, and it is indeed also very much relevant to consider what kind of literature Schmitt is quoting. He starts repeatedly with Virgil. He returns to the Weimar classics like Schiller, for example, when he refers to the quote, "Auf den Wellen ist alles Welle," and so forth. So there is a lot of literary theory contained in this text. My main argument, in a nutshell, is that what Schmitt tries to create here as an archetypical scene to which he returns frequently by arguing that there has been a radical primary act in German. This would be either the radical title or the Uract, is basically or amounts to something like a generative penetration. Generative penetration in the sense that the earth, the motherly earth, and in German you would also use a female article to refer to the earth, so it's not a neutral term, but it's a term that already by its article is associated with the feminine, at least also in the words and the wordings of Schmitt. This earth itself lays there as a land that is waiting for its own taking. And what indeed Schmitt does in a multiple sense is he tries to explain to what extent law itself or the legal act amounts to forms of penetration. So not accidentally in German, he uses also terms like eingefurcht and eingegraben, where you could, I would say, also add eingedrungen, which would be perhaps the most explicit expression that shows and that reveals to what extent the whole argument of Schmitt is in a way transported by this sexual fantasy. On the one hand, the sexual fantasy also illustrates that the creation or a certain narrative of the creation of statehood, of modern statehood as a territorial border regime that controls the land itself, has been from the very beginning saturated with sexual fantasies of a popular marriage between a people and the land on which they are residing, the people that are working on the land, the people that are creating the rightful measure, the people that through their work are making sure that the seed that has been implanted in the land itself is bringing about its own fruition. And interestingly, this whole argument also is built on the idea that there is an other, that the other of the land is
Hermano, estoy malo. Con más pena que la chucha. Tengo más rabia que la weón.
I'm sorry if I missed something or if I triggered something. I hope not.
No, sorry.
Hopefully not some kind of other repressed fantasy. But to cut perhaps a longer reading short, or really to share a preoccupation, I do indeed think that it would make sense to really look at the text, certainly from a metaphorological angle, but also to understand what kind of sexual metaphors are at play in Schmitt's work, and to what extent this confrontation between the sea that cannot be owned, the sea that cannot be taken, at least not in traditional terms, is that what also reveals that the very taking of the land itself is accompanied by a repressed fantasy of the sea itself. I think that this becomes very explicit also towards the end of the corollary itself, where Schmitt is in a way also alluding to the fact that the new powers, the new powers of the earth are former islands that were successful in making use of the watery element, of the fluid element. So he's certainly thinking here, and he was not the first of England who was able to transform the steam energy into the energy that eventually allowed them to increase their maritime skills, to go also overseas and to control effectively also the sea. So at the very end of this corollary, Schmitt is alluding that England's actual power resides in their use of the sea itself as that fluid moment which Schmitt hopes to eventually control or to regain control by again refounding a territorial statehood. So these are just a few very basic glimpses, and it's all but consistent argument. Rather an invitation to perhaps think of some of the populist fantasies that are very much part of our present, that are extremely capable of attracting votes, of capturing sentiments. But one of the reasons why I think they are so capable of doing that is because they do, in fact, also make use of sexualized fantasies. And Schmitt itself, to my opinion, is in that sense a very explicit offer that reveals to what extent also the current populist movements are making use of these wet fantasies.
Thank you, Andreas. Cesar, would you like to continue?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Saida, for your invitation. By the way, today I am not at home, so I don't know if this network is very stable. So please let me know if I get lost at some point. Well, yeah, just tell me. Well, so I'm gonna read my position paper. It's very short. It's only 2 sheets, and it's entitled "Carl Schmitt and the Death of Metaphor in Politics." So I start. Can a metaphor die? Of course, this question is based on a metaphor. Since a metaphor is not alive, it cannot die. But then the question shifts into something else. Can a metaphor be alive? If the living things produce themselves, but also other things, autopoiesis and heteropoiesis, we could say that sometimes some crucial metaphors become auto and heteroproductive. If this is true, perhaps the idea of a living metaphor in Paul Ricoeur is not, after all, only a metaphor. Such matters are beyond our scope for now. I content myself with pointing out a hypothesis regarding the life and death of metaphors. The thought of Carl Schmitt points out to a possible death of metaphors in politics. Such things could mean the death of politics, but in doing so, since the very moment that this is also a metaphor, something different could emerge from that. Here we could repeat those verses wrote by Hölderlin, which were happily cited by Heidegger. Wo aber Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch. When Schmitt refers to the nomos of the earth, he thinks of a subjective genitive, which means that the nomos derives from the earth as a consequence and a property of its own. With such a thesis, Schmitt gives a step backwards in history, according with the ideal of a conservative revolution. In the Old and Middle Ages, the nomos was dictated by some kind of natural force, because the force of a king or the force of an army was so as a natural tendency. But with the rise of modern and illustrated state, we witness the explicit split between natural and positive law. Schmitt proposes an overcoming of that modern perspective. The law, nomos, from now and once again, should be derived from natural instances, such as the natural limits traced by the forests, the sea, the mountains, the sea. It is not the language nor the culture, but to belonging to a territory which defines the people, the folk, and the state. Perhaps this is one reason for the Heidegger's criticism on Schmitt. The Freiburger philosopher considers in his course of 1934 and 35, a very, very complicated period, as you know, this course was dedicated to the Hegelian philosophy of right. And there, Heidegger considers that the Schmittian perspective ignores the ontological tension and considers only the ontic dimension of politics. On the contrary, he accuses Hegel of holding a purely ontological perspective and forgetting the ontic dimension. Of course, this is not the place to evaluate such allegations. Let us only pay attention to the fact that the law is reduced to the force of nature in Schmitt. This implies, in a semantic level, that there is only one single channel of reference, that of nature. In the deployment of this univocalism, I suggest, we witness the death of the metaphor in politics, since metaphoric thought requires always at least two semantic levels. For Schmitt, there is only the nomos of the earth. I would like to suggest that this return to the political monopoly of nature could lead us back to the thesis supported by Thrasymachus in the Republic, where we found Plato very concerned about the consequences of such naturalism. In fact, some commentators have said that the entire dialogue is a struggle looking for an effective way to neutralize the naturalist thesis of Thrasymachus. By the way, a similar naturalism is criticized by Levinas in Quelques réflexions sur la philosophie de le Hitlerisme, this very short work about Hitlerism. Levinas holds that Hitlerism consists in a sort of enchaînement, and maybe we could translate this word as attachment or chaining. In Spanish, it's something like encadenamiento, to the pure brutality of nature, in the form of race, blood, or soil. And this is also the danger in the thought of Schmitt. Back to Plato, the problem he observes is that the exclusive guidance of natural forces to direct the polis conducts to the possibility of tyranny, and to get away from the best version of polis and the human psyche. For the Greek philosopher, it is necessary an eidetic level of thought, from which we can deny pure factuality and to which we can turn. With this gesture, Plato introduces a second level of reference and, with it, a first step towards metaphoricity in politics. It is not by chance that this thought cannot proceed without metaphors, again and again, even though he himself tries to eliminate them. I suggest that this is one of the main temptations in political thought, to eliminate metaphoricity. But the other temptation is to consider literally the metaphor, which drives us paradoxically to the same death of metaphors. The challenge is to stay in the middle of the tension, and that is a trace of politics. And to conclude, there is something like saving das Rettende in the danger opened by Schmitt. Since the very moment that the death of the metaphor is possible, this invites us to stay in the middle of the struggle, where metaphoricity can indeed die. But if it can die, it is only because it is still alive. And if it is alive, isn't it a natural force? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think creí que se había perdido, pero sí me
No, no.
escucharon. ¿Verdad?
Sí, todo. Thank you. Arturo, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you, girls. Thank you very much also for all the work behind the workshop. Well, first, it was very interesting to listen to a horny Schmitt. It was an interesting metaphor. But I wanted to concentrate on the very concept of nomos. You know, the first thing, at least in the part we agreed to read. Well, it doesn't matter. I think we took different passages and different pages, I think, but I concentrated, or at least I will speak about the very definition of what is nomos, and I the relationship between nomos and earth, because what I heard right now from Cesar is that there is some kind of naturalism, but I would argue against that, and I would like to show that the idea of nomos is very closely related to Husserl's idea of institution, Stiftung, and origin, Ursprung in Heidegger. But before coming to that, the main point, or if you want the Leitfaden, is what does it mean, the nomos? He's very careful at the beginning of the paragraph we're discussing to say it's not the law, it's not Gesetz. He says that, but nonetheless there is some relationship to law, and how to interpret this. And my suggestion is that we have to go back to two thinkers. One is Weber, and the other is Hegel. In political theology too, he very clearly refers to Hegel and to the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, in which he says that there is a moment of absolute freedom, and we could say sovereignty, in ethicity, that is in Sittlichkeit, in the very moment in which we shift from the national and contingent content of people, of the folk, into the universal form of the state. But he's not saying, I mean, at least the reading of Schmitt is not that. There is something like an elevation above the particularities of the people, of the folk, but rather on the contrary, that the state elevates the content of culture and of folk into its most general form as self-determination. And self-determination is absolute spirit. And this doesn't take place in universal history, but in very particular nations within the context of universal history. To put it in other terms, the act of absolute sovereignty and freedom of the spirit for Hegel is the state. And I think this is the part in which this is the part that interests Schmitt the most. So the first my first idea is to read the idea of nomos very closely to the Hegelian idea of Sittlichkeit. That is my first suggestion. But the second one, because he's actually saying in this political theology too, that the content, the context in which he's reasoning is actually the philosophy of spirit of Hegel and the role the state plays in the objective spirit. the other thing, the other suggestion or the other path we could follow is to read the concept of nomos together with that of ethics and spirit geist in general from Max Weber. Why? You know this very famous text about the spirit of capitalism and the Protestant ethics, and he's very ambiguous because he says that he's not going to define what is spirit, what is the Geist, and he's also not saying what is ethics. But there are some hints that the concept of ethics really is related to the concept of Sitten. And Sittlichkeit from Hegel, but also from spirit in the sense of that particularity of some people that gives them some openness to the world and some structure, which is absolutely spiritual. That is, he goes against the grain and against the Marxist politics and philosophy, both Schmitt and Weber, in which they're trying to show that it's not material forces what drives history, because it has happened other times that you have accumulation or even greed, but there is something spiritual that guides history, and this spiritual dimension is called Sittlichkeit in Hegel. It's called Geist or spirit in Weber, and I think, this is my hypothesis, should be read as nomos. But there is something else, because Schmidt's not only interested in showing, some sort of changes in history, those breaks in which something new emerges, but he wants to show the very origin of the political and the very origin of the legal universe. So he says, I would say that the concept of nomos is related to the moment of institution of spirit, institution of Sittlichkeit. What's the idea behind? He says there is something like the earth, and the earth is really not nature. It really, I liked what Andreas was saying, because it's really not some indifferent nature. It's more like a woman waiting to be taken, right? Because the word he uses is Landnahme. You have to take it, and you cannot take what is not given to you in some sense. I mean, you could say that it's a whole fantasy to think that you can really possess and take possession of the earth, because you don't do that. The only thing you do, if you take possession of some territory against someone else, excluding someone else, and defining the whole dimension of the political as enemy and friend or foe. So the moment of the institution is not the appropriation of nature, is the appropriation of some already at hand, some earth at hand. So he says, with the appropriation of territory comes law, because you can only reign in a particular part of the world. But at the same time, when you take this territory, you make a law for it, and then just after that, then you can, so to speak, divide the territory. I mean, politically and sociologically and in classes, whatever you want. But you, so to speak, divide the territory and say who belongs to which part, for example. And then once you define that, you give access to that differences, different types of people who have different access to the land, and then you can take care and dwell in that space. So the earth is not nature, and I think that's very important to understand. It's not some part of the world that does not belong to human history. On the contrary, it's more like, in a very helomorphic scheme, matter waiting to receive form from the outside, and form from the outside is imposed by a subject. And this violence of the subject makes possible the birth of the folk, and the birth of the folk as being part of the world. So the first thing is the earth is not nature. That's one thing. The second thing is that nomos is an act of subjective decision. It's institution, but it's at the same time material and subjective. It's like taking body of the subject through the earth. Now, that was the first point. Now, the second thing I would like to draw upon is the idea that there is a tension between earth and water, or between land and water, or sea and land. You know, here in this very text, and also in land and sea, he also tackles the question of how there is in his worldview of political theology, there is a fall. I mean, after the Westphalia peace, there was this origin of a territory called Europe, inside which law could regulate relationships between different states. And outside, because they took it, that's the Landnahme, the original Landnahme. But outside, there is no law, and that's why you have the right to conquer and destroy and kill everything not belonging to the original territory of Europe. But this is so to speak the part of original appropriation. I will okay, 1 minute. But the second part is there is a fall, and the history of the fall in history is how we betray the earth, and how we betray land, and we cede to the powers, the seducing powers of the sea. And he quotes in the it's in the last part, the afterword of the nomos of the earth. It's like 1 page, I think, and there's a quote in Hegel's philosophy of right, saying something. I don't have it here, or maybe yes. Well, I will just say a couple of I will read a part of the quotation of Hegel's philosophy of right in paragraph 247. He says, "As the firm set earth or the soil is the basis of family life, so the basis of industry is the sea." So you can see, and you can read probably the idea that there is a relationship between capitalism, globalization, if you want, and the sea. Why? Because the natural element which stimulates intercourse with foreign lands is the sea. That is, we leave the soil and the limited round of appetites and enjoyments embraced within the civic life for the fluid element of danger and destruction. The passion for gain is transformed, and Hegel concludes, all the great aspiring nations press to the sea. So, really, what Schmitt is calling to is to stop the fall, and the fall is the sea. And the only way to save us from the apocalypse, I mean, the katechon, the figure of the katechon, is to come back to land and to deploy civic life as it reigned in the old Europe. But, and I conclude, the problem is, this is the fantasy, and I would pretty much agree upon what Andres was saying. There is an absolute fantasy of the return of the powers of the earth against the power of the sea, but there is an additional problem, and this is where I touch very slightly upon metaphors. There is not, we are really not, or our current metaphor is neither land nor water, but air. Information and the net, and we speak about the cloud and data and information. There's actually a complication in which it becomes even more difficult to integrate land and sea, because there is this dimension of air. But I will leave it here. Thank you very much, and I hope we can discuss these ideas a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. So if you want to participate, raise your hand, please. Stiff, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you to the three of you for your great comments. I'm not sure to which one this question goes. Maybe triggered by Andreas, who is not here anymore in this moment. But actually, like my thing is, he's here. Okay, great. You are here. So I'm a bit surprised that it seems somehow common sense that Schmitt is taking here a normative stance when he's talking about, like in the first sentence of the corollary, when he talks about the mythical language that refers to the connection of law and earth. So I think he's using this wording also on purpose. He says in mythical language, we relate law and earth in these three ways. No, the earth containing law and manifesting law, and law can be inscribed on it. And I think if we take myth really as a naturalizing something historical, he's completely correct here. And these naturalistic fantasies that are quite sexualized, of course, are not necessarily Schmitt's fantasies, but the fantasies of the life form and the history of the life forms he is analyzing and describing. I think he gets normative in a very different way and much later, because then, I mean, the next chapters he's doing legal history and describes how the modern legal global order developed. And only then, when he talks about this very specific Christian medieval legal order in feudalism, he, I think, posits his normative stance with the idea of, first of all, the bracketed war, that within a Christian order, like when a war of a Christian prince against a Christian prince is fought, then this is bracketed and it's not, it's eingehegt, I think it's in German. I read this part in English. So it's a war that takes place under certain limitations and circumstances and is regulated. And this does not question the global order. And I think, at least in these sections we read, he's not at all questioning this planetary global order that makes international law possible. I think, like, what I really see as his, and you mentioned it, Arturo, as his normative stance, where he's not analytical anymore and he's not descriptive anymore, but he says it's the only possible concept. It's the katechon, the restrainer, and I'm actually not like, I'm still struggling with interpreting this this notion. He says that it's the only possible concept, whatever that means, only possible concept. In which sense only possible? Is it the correct concept? Is it the adequate one, or is it really, in which sense is it the only possible concept to bridge the notion of the empire and the notion of eschatological paralysis? This is the wording. So yeah, that's the unease. Like, I don't see that Schmitt is taking part for Earth against sea.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Florian, and then I allow myself to include myself in the list.
Yeah, thank you for your talks. I also have a question for Andreas. It seems to me that you're ultimately calling for some combination of metaphorology and psychoanalysis. And if that is indeed the case, I wonder how you think that combination might be accomplished without resorting to some kind of Jungian archetypes. So that's my question.
Thank you, Florian. One question for me, it's for all of you. I had the impression that talking about Schmitt and also myself, while I was reading Schmitt, I was wondering to which extent can we establish a link between what we discussed earlier and what Andreas is also suggesting, a metaphorological point of view, and Schmidt's own considerations on concepts and metaphors. This question appeared when I read, and then you mentioned it as well, something alike to what we were discussing, Miranda and I, when we were referring to how Blumenberg referred to absolute metaphors as images that resist being conceptualized. And I have the impression that Schmitt is defending in a way that we cannot reduce this natural or naturalized image of law to a concept and to positivity. So to which extent could we talk about a continuity between Blumenberg and Schmitt concerning the nature of this image? I don't know if this is a clear question, but if you have thoughts concerning that possible relationship, that would be very interesting for me to hear. Thank you. Go ahead, Arturo.
Yes. Wait. Right. Well, yeah. I think my suggestion to read Schmitt through the eyes of Weber was to put him in the context of the criticism of 19th sort of century Germany and the unification. Because I pretty much think that when you see that he's not arguing anymore, that he's not giving, reasons on why the earth would be superior in some sense, you have to go back not only to previous writings of his, but especially to Weber and his criticism of German society after unification as Entzauberung. The recurse to myth is needed, and it's explainable only in the face of the disenchantment of the world. And that's a concept of Weber. The other element of Max Weber is the rationalization of the world, which means a very fast or a change at a very fast pace from the old Germany based in some social and religious structures into the world of capitalism, to reach the rest of European nations. So Germany plays pretty much, I'm not saying that it is, but it plays pretty much the place that the third world played in the 20th century. That is, to be forced to industrialization and capitalism very fast and to suffer the destruction of the old world of values. So that's why also the main problem of Weber and of Nietzsche and eventually for Schmitt is values, because value is like the last resort to save us from the objectivation of the world. But at the same time, once values oppose or are opposed to the world, to the material world, they lose also their power. Because once you say that you have to value the world and the only human or what is left in us of subjectivity is valuing the world, at the same time, you sever yourself from objectivity, and then you run into nihilism or into some sort of cynicism. And I think the nomos of the earth is an attempt to ground the subjective decision in the materiality of the world, in the actuality and concretion of the world. And only there, and only for that reason, you can understand why he's opposing earth and sea. Because you see, Weber thinks that it's not the rationalization of the world and the power of technology and science upon the world and every corner of life is called capitalism. It's not only the state, it's not liberal modern state, it's also capitalism. And the sea stands as the metaphor of capitalistic nations, like, and above all, England. Right. So when you have, if you think of music, Wagner is writing music about German myths, while English composers are writing to the planets and the sea. Think, for example, in Vaughan Williams' A Sea Symphony. It's a symphony not dedicated to human spirit, but to the sea, or in Turner, right? So this is a romantic painter, or even later. Okay, I will not deviate, but those are the points. So the opposition to capitalism is really not that clear in Schmitt, because he's opposing, so to speak, the side of the state, of the liberal state, and positivistic law, and that's why myth plays the important role of invoking a leader capable of giving and providing sense, Sinn, in an originary fashion. And that demands to go back to earth, to go back to traditions, and go back to, so to speak, the Geist of the German people and the Sittlichkeit upon a certain territory. But so far, that's what I can say.
Okay, thank you, Andreas.
Yeah, I will try to perhaps condense some of the questions that were posed and reflect on them very briefly. Was Schmitt normative at the very beginning of the nomos of the earth, or was he not? It depends very much on how we understand normativity itself. And here I would also recall the argument by Arturo that it depends very much on the ways Schmitt himself tries to make sense of nemein as this nomen actionis, where he's suggesting that it has never been a word that can be used as a noun, but we need to understand it as some kind of action. To a certain extent, he does, in a way, repeat Heidegger's own gesture when Heidegger speaks of legain, or tries to explain why logos basically means legain, first of all. Schmitt does something similar, but it has been pointed out and noted in literature, and I find this argument very interesting, that when Schmitt tries to reflect on nemein by bringing it back on the first syllable of nem, he focuses only on nemein in transitive terms. So that form of taking what takes something. Whereas it has been pointed out that Deleuze, for example, used the same philological sources and rather focused on the intransitive part, where people, nomads, which etymologically refers to the same, dispersing on the land, but without taking it. And so I think it's already interesting that Schmitt's own reflection on what does nomos stand for tries to specifically forget a potential intransitive reading of the word itself. This, in a way, does already prefigure, to my opinion, Schmidt's own normativity. So I would fully agree when Steffi is pointing out that we can hardly assume that Schmitt wanted to go back to return to an original state, or where he alluded that we basically could overcome the complications of the present by romanticizing something that is lost. But we do note that, or notice that Schmidt's argument is to a certain extent a melancholic argument. So his own analysis of the present stands or reflects, first of all, a form, an archetypical act of taking, which itself is already split, because he doesn't acknowledge that there can be a form of nomos which doesn't take anything at all in possession. So here I would say lies perhaps the normative force of Schmidt's claim already. Which in a way does also relate to his own analysis of the present. What do we do with that in terms of a critique? Does this require some kind of combination between metaphorology and psychoanalysis? And if so, what kind of psychoanalysis? I wasn't thinking of Carl Jung, so I myself am not thinking in archetypical terms here. But I would say that there are important or relevant crossings here to be taken into consideration. So it is probably also not a coincidence that historically, at least not very distant from Carl Schmitt, Freud, quite known, was thinking of the Urhorde and the initial killing of the Urvater, where then a certain institution is taking place. To again also refer to the Stiftung itself. For Schmitt, sorry, now for this Freudian slip, for Freud, it was very clear that any form of societal foundation reflects a sexual act of generation. Freud obviously did not think of this in metaphorological terms, so I would think that some sort of cross-pollination of metaphorology and psychoanalysis could help us to understand what Freud did in metaphorological terms, but it would also help us what happens here in psychoanalytical terms if we look at some of these recurrent metaphorological fantasies that still haunt our present.
Okay, Cesar?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to answer to some points by Arturo. First of all, of course, I accept that we need some nuances. Maybe this link between earth and nature and that I established was very, very fast, and of course it's not precisely the same. But I would question your idea that, I mean, maybe that's because you're very Hegelian and you see Hegel, but I wouldn't establish this so fast, this link between Hegel and Schmitt, because for me, I consider, if I'm not wrong, that spirit and Sittlichkeit implies always some kind of negativity, some kind of negation. So the question now is there some kind of this negativity, this negation in the thesis of Schmitt? And that's what I can't find in Schmitt. I don't see the negativity here. For me, what is here in the thought of Schmitt is something more like a very hard way of positivity. That's why, as Andreas said, that's why the nomos is always which comes from this nemain, is always a transitive way, a transitive verb, because it's always, as you said, it comes, and of course Schmitt also stresses that nomos comes from this Greek word nemain, which implies to divide, and he also says in English to pasture. And so here and even the German word, I suppose that the German nehmen, to take, for example, also comes from this root, I suppose. So the question is, because as you said, for Schmitt, this nomos comes from the appropriation of the earth. But what we have to question here is, where does this appropriation comes from? It comes from the spirit, it comes from the Sittlichkeit, or to allude to the to that album by Pantera, it's just a vulgar display of power. I'm not sure, because I just wanted to point out the risk that these ideas could imply a justification for the appropriation of every space. For example, it could justify the idea of the German Zeitraum, for example. That's very dangerous, no? Or it could justify the idea of every kind of colonization. So that's what I want to point out, that I don't see the negative moment in Schmitt, and that's why I wouldn't relate so fast Schmitt and Hegel. And so with this, and just to finish my commentary, just to allude to the question that Saida question asked, if there is a continuity between Blumenberg and Schmitt. Of course, I'm not an expert at all in Blumenberg, neither in Schmitt, but if for Blumenberg this metaphoricity is kind of a living force in the thought. Thus, metaphoricity also works, also operates in the thought of Schmitt. And for me, the answer is, well, yes, because of course there are a lot of metaphors here, but I see that, and that's why that's the reason for the title of my intervention. But I see the tendency to kill the metaphoricity here, because if this original appropriation is something that derives from the earth and from original forces, there is only one level of references. I'm not sure if I'm being clear, but for me, I see a gap between Blumenberg and Schmitt.
Okay, I would love to continue the discussion, but we are super late, and we should let us hear Miranda's comment on Schmitt's theological politics.
Yes, well, this I think we can continue the discussion because it's gonna touch on similar topics. So I will keep it very, very brief so we can jump right in. This is a text that's written in a period a bit before than this moment in which Schmitt is dealing with the configuration of a global order. It's from 1922, and this is probably one of the most important texts in which Schmittian decisionism is explained. This goes hand in hand. What we read was the third chapter, but maybe just to have a clarification of the first chapter, that it's what he's building upon, is the idea of an impossibility of defending legal positivism. So it's an argument against liberal normativism and the parliamentarian conception of politics, in which he shows that every legal order is based on a sovereign decision and cannot be understood simply as a product of a norm. That's the thing we have to keep in mind in order to jump into the problem of exception. So the idea is that the application of a norm presupposes the existence of a state of normality, and that the sovereign is the only one with capacity to determine whether in a particular circumstance there is a normal or not a normal state, what we call a state of emergency, an Ausnahmezustand. What we are going to deal with in the chapter 3 is a genealogical analysis of how modern political constitution came to be, in which by political theology we're always referring to a relationship of politics with the theological sphere, and what it's expressing is an opposition to the liberal pretension of achieving a complete neutralization based on what is called this great modern ideas, liberal rational, of the separation between theology and politics. What he states is that there is an analogy of the problem of exception and the problem in politics and the problem of the miracle in theology. So basically that this division that we can see in politics today corresponds to division made in theology between theists and deists. So to those that believe in the miracle, believe in a moment in which God can intervene on earth, and those who believe that God simply created a legality and let it develop without any further intervention. So what he's pointing out is that in the political modern world, even after having been stripped of this divine entity, it maintained the conceptual framework derived from a theological structure. So the punchline here is all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. And then comes the tricky part, because this can be interpreted in two different ways, and Schmitt himself is gonna vary it up throughout his life. So the things that he say in Political Theology 1 are not gonna be exactly the same as in Political Theology 2. But the idea is that in the modern theory of state, the place of God would have been occupied by the almighty legislator. And this double structure of theology between revealed scripture and natural theology would be reproduced by a secular binomial relationship between constitution and jurisprudence. The question that arises from this idea of the concepts of the modern theory of state and the theological concepts is a question of whether there is merely a structural affinity between these two spaces, or whether there is a derivation, whether the modern state is simply, let's say, a gounded, like a covered up structure that is merely replicating a previous one. In this part that we read, there is a certain amount of ambiguity, because the analogy is played out in two senses. On the one hand, as a process of historical derivation, and on the other, and this is probably more radical, as a structural necessity, as saying that it cannot be in any other way. This will vary with the dialogue with Blumenberg, in which the catechon will play a very big role, and maybe we can get. I was not planning to go into that, but maybe since it came up, we can go into it a bit later. Now, this ideas that he's sustaining here are interesting, because different as what it happens with the text that we discussed previously, this had a very broad reception, not only between the right, but also in the left, especially in Italy. So Schmitt, that is himself a very controversial character, has been kind of the grounding figure for most of the most radical leftist proposals in political theory. And what can be, let's say, drawn from him is that from this theory, independently of from which side you're reading it, is that there's contradictions inherent to liberal democracy that people are failing to see. Basically, that there's something that is occluded by this idea that the Rechtsstaat is where law and the state are the same thing, and there is nothing outside of that. He's fighting the idea that the state is the product of rational activity of the subject and that it's neutral. He says that the law is an order that recalls the contingency from which it has arisen. And this also, I think, plays a bit of a parallelism with Blumenberg's theory. So in Blumenberg, the concepts remind you of the void missing that is covered by a metaphor. Here, the law is simply covering up a void of normative order that has to be instated by a decision. Yeah. So what is interesting about this proposal, it's also that what we're seeing in this parallelism between theology and politics, it's, as said, not only a historical derivation that can be discussed, but also a rhythm between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between norm and exception. And the bourgeois denial of this decision leads to a state of indeterminacy that refuses to look at the exceptional case and takes refuge in discomfort of a normative regularity that cannot defend itself. Like when it comes to this border moments, this extreme conflictive moments, there is no way of defending the norm just because of the norm. I would argue there's a lot of debate here that political theology is not necessarily like the defense of a theological foundation of politics, but that is merely pointing out to the historical and categorical context in which modern state theory was built. So this genealogical interpretation is accepting that there's a secularization happened, but this secularization is not a movement that is evolutionary and progressive, leaving behind the theological, but it's a discourse in which the origin of modernity is determined both by this lack of substance, of divine substance, but a permanence of coercion to order that holds the same monist principle. And then ultimately this normative system, considered from the point of view of a decision, comes out of nowhere. And this is what we have to deal with. No, this also relates a little bit with what was said at the beginning of Hannah Arendt's text. There's nothing to fall upon. Two things that I would like to point out that are very interesting. One of them I've been thinking for a long time, and I've read a lot of opinions, and I think it's very relevant for the discussions we're having, is that in the second edition of The Legitimacy of the Modern Age, where Blumenberg has already had correspondence with Schmitt, he dares to describe political theology as a metaphorical theology. And this is very, very, very complicated to understand, because it requires an effort to think whether that is a legitimizing or a critical utterance. It's not very clear. It could be both, could be played on both sides. The second thing that it's interesting is that in the Nachlass of Blumenberg, there's a note written and entitled Political Theology 3 that says that this is clearly a critic, and says that political theology will always want to reproduce the absolute. So basically that what Schmitt's doing is simply masking theological politics through the idea of political theology. And he accuses Schmitt of doing metaphysics by interpreting metaphorics in a literal sense. That was also suggested a little bit before here. However, both Blumenberg and Schmitt share this idea that the metaphysical image of the world corresponds to the image of what is appropriate as a form of political organization. And this same idea provides them with two answers that are opposite, that I already mentioned in the part of Blumenberg, and is that for this lack of substance at the beginning, for one of them, for Blumenberg, just points out to the necessity of postponing the absolute, of postponing the decision, of trying to create a distance towards these menacing forces that endanger human survival. Whereas for Schmitt, there's a necessity of a clear distinction. And I think this is why for the discourses of political theory in the present, Schmitt is such an important figure, because it kind of falls out of the scope of these liberal conceptions of politics that sometimes fail to assume a true political decision and just postpone the issue at hand. So yeah, I think I would leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you, Miranda, for this very nice comment. I think there are a lot of issues that came already in former discussions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand or use the function of the hand. I would like to begin if there's no one who wants to do it. A quick and very general remark or question concerning, again, the relationship between Blumenberg and Schmitt. It's very interesting to notice this analogies between what's going on between concepts and metaphors and what's going on within politics and theology. And in the comment I did to the introduction to paradigms, I was referring to the anthropological perspective from which Blumenberg explains why do we need to refer to metaphors as useful instruments to control the absolutism of reality, just as concepts do. So in this sense, there's no judgment of value. They are both instruments that can help us to lead with reality, so to say. But on the other hand, there's this conflicting or rather unclear, and I have to admit I'm not quite acquainted with that part of Blumenberg's corpus, so to say, the analysis of political myth. So in that sense, I mean, in that respect, I have the impression that political myths, when Blumenberg refers to political myths, the way he does it is assuming that those are the dangers. It's not as if myths or metaphors were used to prevent us to confront or to get lost in the dangers of the absolutism of reality, but instead political myths can be also the danger to avoid. So, and I feel that with Schmitt, the treatment of that dimension of the persistence of theology is not at all perceived as a danger, but rather as something desirable. So I think this is, the main distinction, so to say, in what concerns the analysis of the use of metaphor and myths in the political sphere. I don't know if there's no concrete question, but a lot of clues that we can follow to build an image of the relationship between these two authors concerning myths and metaphors.
Should we gather?
Yeah. Cesar, would you like to?
Okay. Thank you, Miranda, for your presentation. As you said, Schmitt is a very important reference for critical, revolutionary, and leftist thought, but also for the right wing and neoconservative thought. So, and this happens also with Hegel, with Heidegger, for example, who is the author with I work. So my question for you is, where is the point of break in the case of Schmitt? What distinguish the leftist lectures and the right wings lectures? Of course, I know this this traditional division between left and right is very, very, very simple and very tricky. But it's a fact that we have these two tendencies in the when we read Schmitt. So what do you think there are the differences between these two scopes? How can we recognize them?
Does anyone wants to? Yeah, Steph.
I will postpone my questions for a later moment, but I want to use the opportunity to thank you for holding on that late, and even though we're doing overtime, and for working double to join us here. It was super interesting. And I also want to use the moment because Andreas is writing me that I should thank everyone and say goodbye by his part, but he has to bring his kids to bed. So yeah, I think with just looking at the time, I will keep my questions for the next occasion.
Okay, let's accept. Yeah, one last comment question. Keep it short, and then Miranda, you can comment.
Yes, I liked very much your presentation. It was very clear, and I think you highlighted the
We're not hearing.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
There?
No.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, thank you. It seems to me, and I would love to hear your opinion. It seems to me that you said something very, very crucial, which is I think Schmitt is aiming at the absolute. That is, but at the same time, his position is aiming at the impossibility of reaching the absolute because it has to be grounded on nothingness in the Abgrund. So, to which extent, I would ask to you, do you think that the absolute, the idea of absolute decision, is actually covering up the impossibility of the absolute? Because he's saying that in order to achieve plenitude, you have to be grounded in the opposite of plenitude, which is nothingness, which is ex nihilo. So in this very moment in which the subject, as pure spirit, asserts itself beyond nature and naturalization of the world, as it happens in the liberal order, this immediately lacks reality, and it becomes pure valuing of the world. And that is why he tries to resort to some sort of concreteness of the world by speaking of the earth. But at the same time, the idea of nomos goes against all type of normalization and of all type of nature, because he mines, so to speak, the same ground he's looking for. Because if on the one hand he's looking for the earth and values and the civic life, at the same time the state asserts itself through the power of the sovereign despite the contents of the wills of concrete people. So in this sense, that's my question. I don't know what you think. It seems to me that his absolute is really tragical because it's a subject insisting on a subjectivity, looking for some content, but denying all possibility of content. And this is why it becomes so violent, because it just this just can lead to an empty act of violence, which would give reason to Hegel to this, where he says, even evil is better than nature because at least there is a spirit, and spirit is always superior to nature. But thank you, I like it very much.
With this words, let's give Miranda the floor. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree that it's a very melancholic thing that can very easily be turned into a very violent disposition, like affective, as an affective disposition. Schmitt leads very easily to that. And of course, there's also this longing that you very well describe that he shares also with Heidegger, and this anti-modern this anti-modern impetus that tries to hold on to the ground or to the tradition or to the concrete in order to overcome this consciousness of the lack that it's never can be never pushed aside. From this and going into Cesar's question, I think it's a very complicated question, but maybe what I see as main interpretative Strömungen, things like options is that the right wing. This anti-modern feeling is also shared both by very left wing and very right wing. It's a common thing. But I would say that the right wing focuses on the act of institution, of authority, of the thing that comes after the nothingness. And I think the left is concentrated on to look at this lack frontally and to see what is to be done with this lack in creative terms that do not necessarily adhere to the idea of this brutal distinction between friend and enemy, because many distinctions can be made in order to found the political if this lack is not filled by any previous content. But to look at this lack and try to create distinctions above this lack of determination, I think is kind of what the left is trying to uphold as a principle, taking this impetus from Schmitt. But it's a very interesting question. Also, now there's no left and right. The world's a bit, I think these distinctions are also a bit 20th century and not so actual, but it's maybe a good starting point to think. Then on the Blumenberg Schmitt connection, also both share this idea of human beings as lacking, as internally lacking, and this is a thing that also it's very present in both of their theories. What I would say, because the discussion of the political myth in Blumenberg is a bit complicated, when he does the political analysis of political myth, he goes to it more in a descriptive than in a prescriptive intention. And he describes also political myths as the thing that you have to use when there is no logical decision to be made. For example, when Hitler wants to invade Stalingrado, he has to go back to Napoleon and try to figure out through these patterns logic that may lead to where he wants to go. But he nevertheless does in another non-published article, I think non-published, that it's called Moses the Egyptian, a very, very interesting here. And here he's contradicting himself quite intensely, because here he accuses Freud and Arendt of being victims of what he calls the absolutism of truth, and saying that not all truths, not all the things that someone holds to be truth are desirable to be spoken out loud. He uses the case of Eichmann and says that political myths are somehow necessary sometimes to ground things. This is probably the only exception in which you can see a bit of a political stance of Blumenberg in regard with a concrete problem of his time. Because it's this question of whether Eichmann should be trialed in Israel or should be trialed by this international court. And he accuses Arendt of being neglectful of the space in which she's uttering her truth. Just as Freud was also neglectful of taking away the grounding figure of Moses and destroying kind of this myth in a moment where it was not desirable. Yes, that's what I would have to say in regards to. I don't think he himself would think that he's creating myths. He would say that he's doing. He always covers himself saying that he's doing a sociology of concepts, and not any sociology of concepts, but a sociology of concepts made by a jurist, not by a philosopher. He's also all the time covering himself up saying he's just doing juristic analysis. That's clearly not the case. He's proposing a lot of things. Yeah, and then the thing with the Cathecon we leave for later, for the next time. But thank you so much for the discussion.
Thank you very much to all of you. And as Stephanie already said, thank you, especially in Austria, for being awake so late. Thank you. Thank you for following the discussion. And I hope we can meet us again soon and frame again our questions and choose the authors we want to discuss. And yeah, let's keep it alive. Thank you, Stephanie, for your
Thank you very much.
collaboration, and thank you all.
Really,
Thank
thank
you.
you all. It was great. Now go to
Thanks
sleep.
everyone.
Not that late.
For hanging on. See you
Bye.
next time.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.